There is a particular kind of desperation that looks, from the outside, almost like courage. It moves through the night. It hides its intentions behind fog and frozen tree lines. It bets everything, every last reserve, every last drop of fuel, every last young man who has ever known a world without war, on a single, irreversible throw. And it does all of this, not from a position of strength, but from the bleeding edge of collapse. That is where we begin tonight. Not with victory, not with the clean, confident machinery of an army at its height. We begin in the autumn of 1944, in a Germany that is burning from both ends, with a man sitting deep inside a fortified headquarters in eastern Prussia, refusing, with a will that had outlasted the rational judgment of everyone around him, to accept what the map was plainly telling him. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy. Paris had fallen back into French hands. Soviet forces were grinding westward across Eastern Europe, with a momentum that no counterattack had managed to slow. German cities were being reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns that ran day and night. The Reich's industrial capacity was fracturing under the pressure, and the armies defending Germany's borders were not the armies of 1940 or 1941. They were tired, depleted, stretched across distances that their numbers could no longer justify, held together by discipline, by ideology, and by the terrible awareness that surrender offered no comfortable alternative. Most of the generals understood what the numbers meant. Most of them had been trying, in careful and often frightened language, to explain it upward through the chain of command for months. Adolf Hitler did not want to hear it. What he wanted, what he had convinced himself was still possible, was one final, decisive stroke. A surprise offensive through terrain that military convention said was impassable. A thrust through the Ardennes forest, through the hinge of the Allied line, all the way to the port of Antwerp on the Belgian coast. If his forces could reach Antwerp, they could sever the supply lines of the British and Canadian armies in the north. They could cut the Anglo-American alliance in two. They could, perhaps, force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, freeing Germany to deal with the Soviet advance from a position of renewed stability. It was, by any cold strategic analysis, a plan that depended on miracles at every stage. But Hitler had built his entire career on moments when the impossible had briefly appeared to work, and around him there were men, specifically men who wore the black-collar insignia and the runes of the Waffen-SS, who had been trained from their earliest years to believe that will was stronger than mathematics, that fanaticism could overcome material reality, that the purity of ideological commitment could substitute for fuel, for ammunition, for numerical superiority, for all the things that Germany no longer had enough of. These were the formations that would lead the northern thrust of what German planners called Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a defensive name, deliberately chosen to obscure offensive intent. Behind that name, in forests and back roads, and carefully blacked-out assembly areas around Cologne, the 1st SS Panzer Corps was gathering in secret through November of 1944. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the division that had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard and grown into one of the most feared armored formations in the German order of battle. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation whose soldiers were, in many cases, literally teenagers, young men who had grown up inside the machinery of the Third Reich and had never known a version of Germany that was not at war with the world. Together, alongside motorized grenadiers and artillery units, and formations assembled from whatever reserves could be scraped together, they would be the edge of the blade. Across the line, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the American First Army held a front that stretched for roughly 200 kilometers, with divisions that were exhausted from months of hard fighting, understrength, and spread far thinner than any defensive doctrine recommended. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet, a place to rest units, to rotate men out of the line, to consolidate before the next push. Nobody seriously expected the Germans to come through there, not in winter, not through that terrain, not with what German forces were believed to have left. That assumption was about to be tested. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 16th of December 1944, German artillery opened along the entire Ardennes front. What happened next, over the following 6 weeks, would become the largest land battle ever fought by the United States Army. It would produce acts of extraordinary courage and acts of absolute horror. It would expose the fragility of assumptions and the resilience that can appear, sometimes, only when fragility has been fully tested. And at its center, driving the northern spearhead through fog and snow and burning American positions, would be the Waffen-SS. Tonight, we are going to follow that story from its roots to its reckoning. We are going to move through the planning rooms, where a desperate gamble was assembled from the wreckage of German ambition. We will follow the armored columns as they rolled forward through darkness, and we will sit with the American soldiers who woke up that December morning to find the world had changed overnight. We will look honestly at what the Waffen-SS was, not as a legend, not as a propaganda construct, but as a military and ideological institution that left a record written in both battlefield performance and documented atrocity. We will not look away from either part of that record. History does not allow us to. We will stand at the crossroads town of Bastogne, where roughly 7,000 American soldiers chose to hold against forces that vastly outnumbered them and refused to leave. We will watch the weather break and the aircraft return, and we will trace the slow, grinding reversal that turned the greatest German gamble of the war's final phase into the irreversible acceleration of Germany's collapse. And we will follow the story all the way to its legal and moral conclusion, to the tribunals, to the accountability, to the international precedents that emerged from documenting what had happened in those frozen forests in the winter of 1944. This is a long story, told completely. If you are settling in for the night, if you are finding a comfortable position and letting the narration carry you, then you are exactly where this documentary was made to be heard. The complete history of the Waffen-SS in the Ardennes is not a short story. It has no simple heroes and no uncomplicated villains. It is a human story, of ideology pushed past the limits of reason, of soldiers on both sides who found themselves inside events larger than any individual choice, and of the kind of reckoning that follows when a war finally reaches its end. Stay with us tonight. If this kind of deep, careful history is what brings you back, subscribe and settle in. There is much more where this comes from, and this channel exists for exactly the kind of audience that wants the full account, not the summary. The fog is rising over the Ardennes. The columns are beginning to move, and somewhere in the darkness of December 1944, the last great gamble of the Third Reich is about to begin. By the autumn of 1944, the war that Germany had once seemed destined to win was collapsing inward from every direction. The armies that had swept across France, driven deep into the Soviet Union, and held North Africa were now fighting defensive battles on foreign soil, and losing them. 4 years of offensive momentum had been spent, like a great engine running dry, and what remained was the grinding machinery of a nation consuming itself to stay alive. German soldiers who had marched through Paris now sheltered in trenches on the borders of the Reich itself, facing enemies who grew stronger with every passing month, while German strength ebbed away. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled European skies, could barely contest air superiority over its own cities. The Kriegsmarine had long since retreated from the Atlantic, and the Wehrmacht, the instrument that had made Hitler's early conquests possible, was being bled white on two vast fronts simultaneously. This was not a crisis that had arrived suddenly. It had been building since Stalingrad, since El Alamein, since the summer of '43, when the last great German armored offensive in the east had ground itself apart at Kursk. But now, in the autumn light of 1944, the reckoning was undeniable and close. In the west, the situation had deteriorated with a speed that shocked even those who had long predicted German defeat. The Allied landings in Normandy during the 6th of June had opened a front that German commanders had struggled to close, and by late summer, the struggle had become a rout. American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces broke out of the Normandy pocket in late July and August, sweeping eastward across France in an advance that consumed hundreds of kilometers of territory in weeks. The German Army Group B, attempting to hold lines that could not be held, suffered catastrophic losses around the Falaise pocket. Entire divisions encircled, their equipment destroyed, their men killed or captured. Paris fell. The Seine was crossed. By September, Allied forces stood on the German frontier itself, looking across the Siegfried Line into the Reich, and British armoured units had surged far enough north to threaten the Rhine. The speed of the collapse had stunned everyone. Even Allied planners, who had expected significant resistance, found themselves ahead of schedule, advancing faster than their supply lines could follow. And for a brief, breathless moment, it seemed the war might end before winter. It did not. The Allied advance slowed as the autumn rains came, and supply lines stretched to breaking point. The failure at Arnhem in September, a bold attempt to seize Rhine crossings by airborne assault, had checked British momentum in the north. American forces had fought brutal battles for the Hurtgen Forest, gaining little ground at enormous cost. The broad front strategy, pursued by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, meant that no single thrust had the concentrated power to deliver a knockout blow. And so the front stabilized, imperfectly, along a line running from the North Sea coast southward, through the Low Countries, and along the German frontier. The Allies were close, but they were not yet through, and that pause, however temporary, gave Germany breathing space, just enough, in the calculations of one man, to attempt something desperate. In the east, the picture was equally catastrophic for Germany. Soviet forces under a series of capable and ruthless commanders had driven the Wehrmacht backward in a series of massive operations that bore no resemblance to the fluid engagements of earlier years. By summer of 1944, Army Group Center, one of the largest German formations on the Eastern Front, had been effectively destroyed in Operation Bagration, a Soviet offensive of staggering scale that erased divisions, corps, and entire armies from the German order of battle. Poland had been swept by Soviet advance. Romania had defected, Bulgaria had changed sides, and Finland had concluded an armistice. The Baltic states were being overrun. Soviet armies now stood on the Vistula, looking west toward the heart of Europe. And in the Balkans, German forces were conducting long and costly withdrawals that consumed men and materiel the Reich could not replace. The Eastern Front, which had consumed the best of the Wehrmacht since June of '41, was now a wound that would not close, and it was deepening every month. Above Germany itself, the sky told its own story. Since 1942, Allied strategic bombing had been methodically dismantling the industrial capacity that sustained German military power. By autumn of 1944, The campaign had reached a level of intensity and precision that made it qualitatively different from anything that had come before. American and British bomber fleets, numbering in the thousands of aircraft on major raids, struck synthetic oil facilities, railway marshalling yards, aircraft factories, and the transportation networks that linked German industry to the front. The synthetic oil campaign had by autumn reduced Luftwaffe fuel production to a fraction of requirements, grounding training programs and limiting operational sorties. Factories that produced tanks, artillery, ammunition, and the countless components of mechanized warfare were being destroyed faster than German engineers could rebuild or disperse them. German cities burned. Civilians endured conditions of steadily worsening privation. Morale in the homeland, carefully managed by the machinery of Nazi propaganda, was being tested in ways that no amount of official messaging could fully conceal. It was against this backdrop, systematic strategic collapse on every dimension, that Adolf Hitler sat in his headquarters, increasingly removed from military reality, and refused to accept the conclusions that the evidence demanded. His health had deteriorated since the assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944, and the physical toll of the conspiracy's aftermath had compounded years of stimulant dependency, sleeplessness, and the cumulative psychological weight of directing a losing war. Those who met him in this period described a man aged beyond his years, his left hand trembling, his posture stooped, his eyes burning with an intensity that had become something closer to fixation than command. He had purged his officer corps repeatedly, dismissed generals who told him uncomfortable truths, and elevated those willing to validate his own operational intuitions. The result was a command environment in which accurate assessment of German weakness was dangerous, and optimistic projections, however untethered from reality, were professionally rewarded. The generals who surrounded him in the autumn of 1944 understood the situation with a clarity their Führer would not share. Men like Heinz Guderian, commanding on the Eastern Front, saw with professional precision what the loss of divisions, the fuel shortages, and the air power imbalance meant for Germany's capacity to continue the war. They argued for strategic contraction, for shortening lines, for conserving the remaining mobile reserves to meet Soviet pressure in the East, which they rightly judged to be the existential threat. A Soviet breakthrough to Berlin was a different order of catastrophe from Allied advances in the West. The Anglo-American alliance, they reasoned, might be negotiated with. The Soviets, given the depth of ideological and military enmity that Germany had cultivated since 1941, would not stop short of total destruction. If reserves existed, they should go east. This was the professional military consensus, and Hitler rejected it entirely. His reasoning, such as it was, ran along different lines. He had convinced himself, against every material fact, that the Anglo-American alliance was inherently fragile, a marriage of convenience between capitalist democracies and Bolshevist ideology that would fracture under sufficient pressure. One decisive defeat of American and British forces, delivered with sufficient shock and speed, might cause this coalition to collapse into mutual recrimination. Britain might seek terms. America, already expressing frustration with the costs of a European war, might withdraw. And if that happened, if the Western alliance fell apart, then Germany could turn its full remaining strength eastward and bargain with the Soviets from a position of some restored credibility. It was not a plan grounded in realistic assessment. It was the product of a mind that had never fully accepted the constraints of material reality, sustained by years of early successes that had seemed to prove intuition superior to calculation. But in the autumn of 1944, isolated in his headquarters, with sycophants filtering his information and yes-men validating his conclusions, Hitler reached for the one tool he believed remained, the offensive. The concept that began to take shape in his mind was audacious in scale and profoundly disconnected from German capacity. He wanted to strike through the Ardennes, the same forested, hilly terrain through which German armored formations had struck so devastatingly in May of 1940. A surprise offensive using concentrated panzer and mechanized forces, driving northwest toward the port of Antwerp, the logistical hub through which the bulk of Allied supplies flowed into northwestern Europe. Severing Antwerp from the Allied front would, in Hitler's calculation, cut off British and Canadian forces in the north from American forces in the south, encircle enormous Allied formations, and deliver the kind of catastrophic defeat that might genuinely force a crisis in the Allied command structure. He presented this concept to his generals with the certainty of a man who brooked no argument. The reserves would be gathered, the fuel would be found, the offensive would be launched before the winter was out. The generals listened, and most of them did not believe it could succeed. Not in the way Hitler imagined. The distances involved were enormous. Antwerp lay more than 200 kilometers from the German start lines. The roads through the Ardennes were few and easily blocked. Allied air power, once the weather cleared, would savage any armored column attempting to move through the open, and the fuel required to sustain a drive of that distance simply did not exist in the quantities the plan demanded. These objections were raised, in varying degrees of diplomatic packaging, and they were overruled. Hitler's response to doubt was dismissal. The generals who pressed too hard found themselves replaced or marginalized. Those who remained learned to carry their reservations privately. What emerged from this process was a plan that bore the codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately deceptive title designed to suggest defensive intentions to anyone who intercepted German communications. The deception worked, at least internally, as an organizing principle, but behind the codename, an enormous mobilization was underway. Panzer divisions, mechanized infantry, artillery formations, and the elite armored units of the Waffen-SS were being assembled in secret, moved at night, concealed beneath forest canopy, and prepared for an offensive that Germany's military leadership privately feared could not succeed, but which they could not refuse to attempt, because the man who ordered it was still, formally and fatally, in command. The autumn of 1944 ended with Germany preparing not to consolidate its defenses, not to shorten its lines, not to preserve what remained of its military strength for the struggles that mattered most. It was preparing to gamble everything on a single throw. The chips being placed on the table were the last reserves of a nation already losing, and the hand was being played by a man who could no longer distinguish between will and capability, who believed that wanting something fiercely enough was itself a form of strategy. The winter was coming. The fog would roll in across the Ardennes, and in the darkness and the cold, the last great German offensive of the Second World War was taking shape. On the maps, spread across Hitler's war room, in the Wolf's Lair, the Ardennes region appeared as a gap, a soft seam running between the Allied armies that had been pushing relentlessly eastward since the summer of 1944. Hitler's generals looked at those maps and saw exhausted divisions, overextended supply lines, and the hard arithmetic of a war that Germany was losing by every measurable metric. Hitler looked at the same maps and saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity, not a modest counterattack to stabilize a collapsing front, not a tactical retreat designed to preserve what remained of German strength, but a full strategic reversal, a single, overwhelming blow that would split the Western Allies in two and force them back to the bargaining table. It was a plan born from desperation, dressed in the language of audacity, and it would demand everything the Reich had left to give. The concept that emerged from weeks of heated argument between Hitler and his senior commanders was built on a reading of history as much as a reading of maps. The Ardennes had been the corridor through which German armor had driven in the summer of 1940, smashing through what the French and British had assumed was impenetrable terrain, bypassing the Maginot Line, and collapsing Allied resistance within weeks. Hitler believed the formula could be repeated. His generals believed, privately and in some cases openly, that the situations were not comparable, that the Germany of 1944 bore almost no resemblance to the Germany that had rolled westward in triumph 4 years earlier. But Hitler had dismissed their objections before, and the institutional machinery of the German military had learned, painfully, that dissent carried consequences. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, took its name deliberately from a famous German patriotic song, and that choice of name was itself a form of deception, designed to suggest to any Allied intelligence operatives who might encounter it that Germany was planning a defensive operation to hold the river line, rather than an offensive thrust through the forests to its west. The name was one layer of a concealment effort that extended across every aspect of the plan's preparation. Signals traffic was restricted, movement orders were transmitted by courier rather than radio, and units assembling in the Eifel region behind the German lines were forbidden from conducting the kind of reconnaissance that might draw Allied attention to the sector. The whole enterprise was shrouded in a secrecy so total that even some senior German officers were kept in the dark until the final weeks before the assault was to begin. The plan itself called for 3 army groups to strike simultaneously across a roughly 130-kilometer front. In the north, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, a man whose military career had been shaped more by loyalty to Hitler than by formal staff training, would drive through the northern Ardennes and make directly for the bridges over the Meuse River, with Antwerp as the ultimate objective. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under Hasso von Manteuffel, would attack through the heart of the forest, pushing past Bastogne and striking for Brussels. In the south, the 7th Army would advance in a largely infantry role, protecting the southern flank of the entire operation as the armored spearheads drove westward. The geometry of the plan was elegant on paper. Whether the forces assembling in the frozen forests of Western Germany could execute it was a different question entirely. The northern axis was the one that mattered most to Hitler, and it was the one he entrusted to the Waffen-SS. The reasoning was ideological as much as it was military. Hitler had long regarded the SS Panzer divisions as his most reliable formations, the ones whose commitment to the National Socialist cause he could count on when Wehrmacht units might waver or retreat. Whether this faith was entirely warranted was a matter the evidence of 1944 had complicated considerably, but the belief persisted, and it shaped the distribution of resources. The 6th SS Panzer Army received priority access to fuel, to replacement vehicles, and to the limited number of Tiger II heavy tanks that German industry had managed to produce in the preceding months. It was, by any measure, the most powerful concentration of German armored force assembled in the West since the Normandy campaign. The composition of the 6th SS Panzer Army revealed both the strength and the fundamental fragility of the plan. At its core were 2 of the most storied formations in the Waffen-SS order of battle: the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which had been Hitler's personal bodyguard formation before evolving into a frontline armored division, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation that had been recruited largely from members of the Hitler Youth and had distinguished itself with extraordinary ferocity during the fighting in Normandy. These were divisions with genuine combat experience. with officers who had spent years in the field and with a reputation, not entirely unearned, for aggressive, technically proficient armored warfare. Flanking these elite formations, however, was a more troubling picture. The Volksgrenadier divisions assigned to support the SS advance were, in many cases, formations rebuilt around a skeleton of experienced soldiers after being shattered on other fronts, padded out with men drawn from the Luftwaffe ground crews, naval personnel transferred to infantry roles, overage reservists, and teenagers who had received abbreviated training measured in weeks rather than months. These were not the divisions that had swept across France in 1940. They wore German uniforms and carried German weapons, but the institutional knowledge, the unit cohesion, and the physical conditioning that had made German infantry so formidable in the war's early years had been ground away by years of attritional fighting on multiple fronts. The plan required them to perform at a level that their training and their numbers could not reliably support. Logistics presented a challenge so severe that it bordered on fantasy. The German military's fuel situation by the autumn of 1944 had deteriorated dramatically as Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic oil production facilities and as the loss of the Romanian oil fields removed another major source of supply. The Ardennes Offensive was allocated a fuel reserve that military planners calculated as sufficient to reach the Meuse River, but only if the armored columns maintained their timetable and captured Allied fuel dumps along the route of advance. This was not a contingency plan. This was a core assumption baked into the operational design. If the advance slowed, if the American fuel depots could not be seized on schedule, the tanks would run dry before they reached their objectives. Hitler and the planners were, in effect, counting on capturing the enemy's fuel to complete their offensive. The margin for error was essentially zero. The armored vehicles assembled for the attack presented their own complications. The Tiger II, the heaviest tank the Reich had deployed, was a formidable weapon whose armor could deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. It was also mechanically unreliable, extraordinarily heavy, and a persistent consumer of fuel that German industry could barely produce. The Ardennes, with its narrow roads, steep gradients, and frequent river crossings, was terrain that favored lighter, more agile vehicles. Moving Tiger-wise through those valleys and across those bridges would slow the entire advance, creating bottlenecks that Allied air power, if the weather cleared, could exploit with devastating effect. German commanders who raised these concerns were told the plan was final. The timeline Hitler imposed was equally unforgiving. The offensive was to begin in the pre-dawn darkness of the 16th of December, 1944, and the armored columns were expected to reach the Meuse within roughly 2 days. Antwerp, more than 250 kilometers from the starting line, was to fall within weeks, on a schedule that assumed American resistance would crumble under the shock of the initial assault, and that the supply lines feeding the Anglo-American forces in the north could be severed before they could respond. Every hour of delay compressed the already razor-thin operational margins further. There was no provision in the plan for a prolonged engagement, no alternative objective designated if Antwerp proved out of reach, no fallback position that represented a meaningful strategic gain. The plan succeeded completely, or it failed completely, and the men who understood this most clearly were, in many cases, the men being ordered to execute it. What makes the architecture of Wacht am Rhein so arresting, in retrospect, is the quality of the thinking that went into its construction, alongside the profound unreality that sat at its foundations. German staff officers were among the most technically proficient military planners in the world, and their work in assembling the deception measures, the order of battle, and the logistical framework for the operation reflected genuine professional skill. The plan was not the work of amateurs. It was the work of professionals operating under constraints that made success almost impossible. Insufficient fuel, insufficient men, insufficient time, and an opponent who, despite the shock of the initial assault, possessed reserves of material and industrial capacity that Germany could not match and could not outlast. The Ardennes Offensive was, at its core, a plan that required everything to go right, in a war where almost nothing had gone right for Germany in over a year. The forests were dark, the fog was thick, and the armored columns were rolling toward their assembly areas. What waited for them on the other side of those ridgelines was a question that would be answered in blood across the frozen ground of the Belgian winter. In the grey, rain-soaked weeks of November 1944, a secret was moving through the forests and backroads of Western Germany. It moved in darkness, under blackout conditions, and it moved in pieces. A tank here, a column of half-tracks there, fuel trucks winding along secondary routes with their headlamps masked to thin slits of orange light. To a passing observer, if any had been permitted to observe, the movement would have seemed unremarkable, even routine. But routine was precisely the point. Every convoy, every troop train, every artillery piece, rolling westward, had been deliberately disguised to suggest nothing more than the grinding, ordinary machinery of a war already being lost. The men who ordered this concealment understood that their plan required one thing above all else before the first shell was fired, that the enemy must not know it was coming. At the center of this gathering was a man whose name had become inseparable from the most radical fighting force the German military had ever produced. Josef Dietrich, known to his men simply as Sepp, had risen from bodyguard to general through a combination of personal loyalty to Hitler, battlefield tenacity, and a coarse, blunt energy that inspired ferocious devotion in the soldiers under his command. He was not a sophisticated military theorist. He had never attended staff college in the conventional sense, and professional Wehrmacht officers frequently looked down on him with barely concealed disdain. But Dietrich understood his men, understood the brutal arithmetic of close-range armored combat, and understood, perhaps better than anyone in that headquarters, what he was being asked to do with the force assembling around him. He was being asked to carry the last real hope Germany had for reversing the war. The formation under his command was the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and it was, on paper at least, formidable. Its two primary armored divisions, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, represented the ideological and military elite of the entire Waffen-SS establishment. The Leibstandarte had existed since the earliest days of the Nazi state, originally formed as a personal protection unit before being expanded, hardened across 4 years of brutal campaigning in France, the Balkans, the Eastern Front, and Normandy, and now reconstituted once more for what its commanders privately understood might be its defining moment. The Hitlerjugend, meanwhile, had been built from the generation that Hitler himself had shaped, teenagers and young men who had grown up knowing nothing other than the ideology of the Third Reich, soldiers of extraordinary aggression and reckless personal courage, though increasingly thin on experience as the war had consumed its older cadres. Alongside these two armored divisions, the Corps assembled a layered organization of supporting formations that reflected both the ambition of the plan and the scarcity of the resources available to execute it. Mechanized grenadier regiments were assigned to exploit the gaps the panzers would tear open, trained to move fast, to bypass resistance, to drive deep into the American rear before defenders could organize a coherent response. Artillery formations were positioned with painstaking care across the Eifel region, their registration conducted in careful increments so that no sudden concentration of fire would betray the scale of what was being prepared. Signals units rehearsed their procedures. Supply officers argued, sometimes bitterly, over the allocation of the most precious commodity in the German military inventory by the autumn of 1944, fuel. The fuel question hung over every planning session, like a weight that no one could fully acknowledge without threatening the morale of the entire enterprise. Germany's synthetic oil production had been systematically dismantled by Allied bombing throughout that year, and what remained was being rationed with desperate precision across all fronts. For the Ardennes Offensive to succeed, armored columns would need to move rapidly and continuously, consuming enormous quantities of petrol and diesel that the German logistics chain could barely guarantee, even on the first day of operations, let alone for the sustained drive toward Antwerp that the plan required. The solution adopted, that the attacking forces would capture Allied fuel dumps along their route and use enemy supplies to keep themselves moving, was not a plan so much as it was a prayer. Staff officers who raised this problem quietly were reminded of their obligations. The calculations, on paper, were technically possible. Paper is patient. Movement to the assembly areas was governed by rules of extraordinary strictness. All major movements were confined to the hours between 6:30 in the evening and 5:30 in the morning, time to fall within the windows of darkness that winter provided in the Belgian and German borderlands. Radio silence was total. No transmissions that might be intercepted, no signals that might reveal the presence of armored formations where none had been before. Even within the German command structure, knowledge of the offensive was tightly compartmentalized. Junior officers and enlisted men knew only that they were moving, that they were to hold their positions in the assembly areas, and that they were forbidden, on pain of the severest military consequences, from any communication that might reach civilian ears or Allied intelligence. The codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was itself a deliberate piece of misdirection, chosen to suggest a defensive posture rather than an offensive one, should it be intercepted. The briefings given to corps and divisional commanders occurred in stages, each stage revealing more of the plan than the last, each stage accompanied by oaths that bound the recipients to absolute secrecy. When the full scope of the operation was finally disclosed, the drive to Antwerp, the encirclement of British and Canadian forces, the splitting of the Allied coalition, the reactions in those conference rooms varied. Some officers were galvanized by it, seized by the conviction that here, at last, was the counterattack that the situation demanded. Others listened with the careful, controlled expressions of men who have learned not to say what they think in the presence of those whose faith in the Führer remained absolute. The plan required a complete breakthrough in the first 48 hours. It required weather that would ground Allied aircraft. It required American forces to collapse rather than consolidate. It required, in other words, everything to go right at once. The assembly areas themselves were concealed beneath the canopy of the Eiffel Forest, a region of rolling, heavily wooded terrain that runs along the German side of the Belgian border. Tanks were driven beneath the tree cover and camouflaged with nets and cut branches. Ammunition was stacked in farmyards and barns, covered with hay and tarpaulin. Thousands of men occupied villages and forest clearings, forbidden from lighting fires after dark, forbidden from unnecessary movement during daylight hours, subsisting on cold rations and the particular, exhausted tension of soldiers who know that something large is coming and cannot yet discharge it. Reconnaissance of the American positions opposite was carried out carefully, in small parties, by men in civilian clothing in some cases, gathering intelligence on the thinly held front that stretched through the Ardennes to the west. What those reconnaissance efforts confirmed was encouraging. at least from the German perspective. The Americans holding the Ardennes front in late November and early December were not the battle-hardened formations that had fought through Normandy and broken out across France. Many were newly arrived units, not yet acclimated to combat. Others were exhausted divisions rotated to the Ardennes precisely because the sector was considered quiet, a place to rest, to absorb replacements, to recover some of the cohesion that hard campaigning erodes from even the best formations. The front was long, and the units holding it were spread accordingly. A sudden, massive assault delivered along multiple axes simultaneously, supported by the full weight of the assembled armor, stood a real chance of shattering that front before a coherent American response could be organized. The Leibstandarte officers studied their approach routes with the intensity of men who have attacked across unpromising terrain before and understand the cost of improvisation. The roads through the Ardennes were narrow, winding, and easily blocked. A single disabled vehicle on a key route could reduce an entire armored column to a stationary line of targets. Route clearance was planned meticulously, with engineer units assigned specific responsibilities for removing obstacles and, if necessary, bridging the rivers and streams that cut across the axis of advance. The Hitlerjugend's commanders, meanwhile, drilled their younger soldiers on the discipline of the advance, on keeping intervals, maintaining communications, pressing forward when resistance stiffened, rather than pausing to consolidate, as inexperienced troops are inclined to do. As November became December, the assembly was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary logistical achievement. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of armored vehicles, enormous quantities of ammunition and supplies had been moved into position without, as far as German commanders could determine, triggering any significant Allied response. Allied intelligence, in fact, had noticed unusual German activity in the region, but had interpreted it through the lens of its own assumptions. That Germany was too weakened to mount a major offensive, that the movement was defensive in nature, that the war was essentially moving in one direction only. Those assumptions were about to be tested in the most violent possible way. By the middle of December 1944, the 1st SS Panzer Corps was in position. The men had been waiting in the cold, in the dark, in the silence enforced by weeks of strict operational security, and now the waiting was almost over. Across the assembly areas, final orders were distributed, final checks completed, final oaths reminded of. The plan asked the impossible of these men: a rapid breakthrough, a sustained drive, a decisive victory against a coalition whose industrial and military strength dwarfed anything Germany could now bring to the field. But the men of the Leibstandarte and the Hitlerjugend had been told something else entirely. They had been told this was the moment everything turned, and in the darkness of the Eiffel forest, with the engines cold and the artillery waiting, and the border ahead, there were men who believed it. There is a particular kind of soldier that conventional military history struggles to fully explain. Not the conscript who fights because he must, not the professional who fights because it is his trade, but the true believer, the man who fights because every fiber of his identity has been shaped, since childhood, around a single consuming cause. By the winter of 1944, the Waffen-SS formations, assembling in the forests east of the Ardennes, were populated by both kinds of men, but it was the true believers who set the tone, who drove the pace, who terrified their own subordinates as much as the enemy. Understanding what drove them is not a comfortable exercise, but it is a necessary one, because without it, the events that followed make no sense at all. The Waffen-SS had never been a conventional army. even when it tried to present itself as one. Its origins lay not in the traditions of the German officer corps or the centuries-old culture of Prussian military professionalism, but in the political violence of the 1920s and 30s, in street brawls, in rallies, in the deliberate cultivation of loyalty to a person rather than a nation, a state, or a constitutional order. When Heinrich Himmler began transforming scattered bodyguard and political protection units into a military force capable of fighting on conventional battlefields, he did not simply adopt Wehrmacht doctrine and dress it in black. He built something philosophically distinct, a formation where ideological commitment was treated as a military asset, where the political education of officers and soldiers was considered as important as their training in tactics, marksmanship, or combined arms warfare. Every man who wore the SS rune on his collar understood, at least in theory, that he was not merely a soldier. He was an instrument of a racial and ideological project whose ambitions extended far beyond the defeat of Germany's enemies on the battlefield. By 1944, of course, the practical demands of a total war had forced compromises on even the most fanatical of institutions. Racial and physical standards that had defined early SS recruitment had been progressively relaxed as casualties mounted on the Eastern Front. Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from occupied territories across Eastern Europe, had been incorporated in large numbers. Some formations had absorbed conscripts from occupied Western countries, whose ideological commitment was, at best, ambiguous. The Waffen-SS of the Ardennes was not the pristine ideological instrument Himmler had envisioned in the late 1930s, and yet, the machinery of indoctrination had not stopped running. Every formation still carried its political officers. Every man had been processed through a system of ideological education that did not merely teach hatred. It structured the world, gave it meaning, offered a coherent, if monstrous framework through which war, sacrifice, and even atrocity could be understood as righteous. No formation illustrated this more starkly than the 12th Times Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend. The division had been formed from boys, and that is not a rhetorical flourish, it is a precise description. Its enlisted ranks had been drawn primarily from the Hitler Youth, the mass youth organization that had, across the preceding decade, replaced nearly every competing institution in the lives of German young people. The church youth groups, the independent scouting organizations, the free-thinking cultural associations, that had once given German adolescents some diversity of experience and belief. Boys who entered the Hitlerjugend at 10 years old and were recruited into the Waffen-SS at 17 or 18 had spent the decisive years of their intellectual and emotional development inside a single, totalizing ideological system. They had been taught that their worth as human beings was inseparable from their worth as soldiers and racial warriors. They had been taught that weakness was not merely a military liability, but a moral failing. They had been taught, with the full emotional power of ceremony, music, ritual, and communal belonging, that dying for the Reich was not a loss, but a completion. This produced soldiers who, in certain tactical circumstances, were genuinely formidable. In the defensive battles of Normandy earlier that year, the Hitlerjugend division had repeatedly held ground against forces many times its strength, suffering casualties at rates that would have shattered most conventional formations, and continuing to fight with a tenacity that impressed and disturbed Allied commanders in equal measure. What it also produced, however, were soldiers with a deeply distorted relationship to the ethical limits that military cultures, even in wartime, even under pressure, typically impose on violence. When the ideological framework that structures your world tells you that your enemies are less than human, that the laws of conventional warfare are bourgeois constraints invented to hobble the racially superior, that mercy is weakness and acceleration of violence is virtue, then the gap between soldier and war criminal becomes terrifyingly thin. The officer corps of the Waffen-SS formations in the Ardennes embodied this tension in its most concentrated form. These were men who had, in many cases, spent their entire adult lives inside the SS system. Men for whom the philosophical content of National Socialism was not a political position, but an existential identity. Among them moved figures whose names would echo through post-war tribunals and historical inquiries for decades. Commanders who had built formidable tactical reputations on the Eastern Front and in Normandy, and whose personal courage was never seriously in question, but whose moral frameworks had been so thoroughly reshaped by ideology that atrocity and tactical decision-making occupied the same undifferentiated space in their minds. Kurt Meyer, known throughout the SS as Panzer Meyer, was among the most emblematic, a man of genuine physical bravery, of real tactical instinct, of charisma sufficient to hold exhausted men in position when every rational calculation said retreat, and also a man whose division had been implicated in the killing of prisoners during earlier campaigns, whose aggressive contempt for any constraint on violence had defined his entire military persona. Meyer believed, in the autumn of 1944, that victory was still possible. He believed it with the fervor of a man whose entire sense of self depended on that belief being true. What Himmler had built, and what the decade of indoctrination had produced, was a culture within these formations where doubt was structurally impossible. In the Wehrmacht, a professional officer who privately concluded that a particular operation was futile could hold that view, keep it to himself, carry out his orders competently, and survive with his identity intact. In the Waffen-SS, doubt was not merely dangerous, it was conceptually incoherent. The ideology did not permit a category for honorable defeat or graceful withdrawal. It recognized only struggle and victory, racial destiny and racial betrayal. An SS officer who allowed himself to consider that the war was lost was not merely pessimistic. He was, by the internal logic of everything he had been taught, a traitor to his race. And so they pushed the doubt down and forward. This psychological mechanism had profound operational consequences as the formations assembled for the Ardennes Offensive, where Wehrmacht commanders quietly expressed reservations about fuel allocations, about the width of front being attacked, about the distance to Antwerp, and the strength of American reserves. SS commanders, in many cases, embraced the plan with a conviction that overrode professional calculation. This was not stupidity. Several of these men were genuinely talented operational soldiers. It was something more troubling, a trained incapacity for the kind of sober, evidence-based strategic assessment that might have led them to argue more forcefully against an operation whose logistical foundations were visibly inadequate from the beginning. Faith in the Waffen-SS was not a supplement to military professionalism. In too many cases, it had replaced it. The enlisted men carried their own version of this burden. For the teenage soldiers of the Hitlerjugend, for the veterans of 3 years of Eastern Front combat who had been ground down and rebuilt by the SS machine, the offensive was invested with a meaning that went far beyond the capture of Antwerp or the splitting of the Allied coalition. It was a moment of vindication, proof that the struggle had not been in vain, that the sacrifices of the previous years had been building towards something real. The enemy was not merely a military opponent to be defeated, but a representation of everything the ideology told them threatened the survival of their people. This emotional loading did not make them better soldiers in any technical sense. It made them harder to stop, even when stopping was the rational response. and it made them capable of things that soldiers fighting for more limited and earthly objectives rarely did. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS had fought side by side across years of war, and professional Wehrmacht officers had learned to appreciate, often grudgingly, the raw fighting power that ideological motivation could generate. They had also learned to dread what came with it, the absence of restraint that ideology produced, the blurring of the line between military necessity and deliberate cruelty, had consequences that rippled outward from SS formations and contaminated the broader military effort. Civilian populations, who might have been quiescent under conventional occupation, became sources of resistance. International opinion hardened. The moral authority that even an aggressive nation requires to sustain alliances and seek negotiated outcomes was consumed, systematically, by formations that treated restraint as weakness. By the December of 1944, the ideology had done its work so thoroughly that even the visible evidence of approaching defeat could not penetrate the belief system it had constructed. Young men of 17 and 18, boys who in another world would have been sitting examinations or learning trades, were climbing into half-tracks and panzer crews in the pre-dawn darkness of the Ardennes, genuinely convinced that the blow they were about to strike would change the course of history. Their commanders, older, more experienced, haunted by ghosts from Kharkov and Normandy, perhaps privately less certain, were nonetheless incapable of the institutional honesty that might have saved thousands of lives, German and American alike. They had been built for attack, for aggression, for the absolute commitment that ideology demands and reason cannot always supply. They were, in every sense the regime had intended, true believers, and true believers, pointed at an objective they cannot reach, with resources they do not have, in service of a cause already lost, are among the most dangerous things that can exist on a battlefield. By the late autumn of 1944, the Allied command structure was built on momentum. After the extraordinary breakout from Normandy in the summer, after the liberation of Paris, after the headlong pursuit of a retreating Wehrmacht across France and Belgium, the assumption at every level of Allied leadership was that the war was moving in one direction only. The broad front strategy, championed by General Dwight Eisenhower, called for advancing American, British, and Canadian forces along a wide line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, applying pressure everywhere simultaneously, grinding down German resistance through sheer weight of men and material. It was a logical strategy, rooted in industrial logic and the hard arithmetic of attrition, but it had a consequence that would not become obvious until German artillery lit the pre-dawn sky over the Ardennes. A front that stretches across hundreds of kilometers demands soldiers to fill it, and by December of 1944, Eisenhower simply did not have enough of them. Every kilometer of Allied line represented a calculation, a gamble on where the enemy would and would not strike, and somewhere in that calculation, the Ardennes had been judged a manageable risk. The Ardennes itself shaped that judgment. Stretching across southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, the region was a dense expanse of forested hills, deep river valleys, and narrow, winding roads that offered only limited axes of advance for any mechanized force. The terrain had a reputation, earned across centuries of European warfare, as a natural barrier, formidable in winter, difficult to move through, harder still to supply through. Allied planners remembered that the Wehrmacht had crossed it in May of 1940, but that event had been so extraordinary, so violently disruptive of every military assumption of its era, that it seemed to most officers less a repeatable operational template and more a singular shock, a rupture in the expected order of things that had already spent its element of surprise. The Ardennes had fooled the world once. Surely it would not fool it again. That reasoning, while not entirely without logic, embedded a dangerous complacency at the heart of Allied planning, one that deepened with every quiet week that passed through November and into December. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group held overall responsibility for American operations along this front, but it was the 1st Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges that was directly responsible for the Ardennes sector. Hodges had roughly 83 kilometers of that front assigned to a single corps, with a handful of divisions spread across a line that should, by any orthodox standard, have required 2 to 3 times as many troops to defend with confidence. The divisions stationed there were not chosen because they were the strongest available. They were there precisely because the Ardennes was considered secondary, a zone for recovering formations, for introducing green units to combat under manageable conditions, for giving exhausted men a chance to rest behind a front that nobody expected to ignite. That logic, too, was not irrational in isolation, but it meant that as December deepened and the first frost settled over the forested ridgelines, the American front in the Ardennes was held by men who were either very new to war or very tired of it. Among those tired men were the veterans of the autumn fighting along the German frontier, soldiers who had pushed through the Hurtgen forest in some of the most brutal and costly close-quarters combat of the European campaign. The Hurtgen had been a grinding, miserable affair, a battle fought through dense trees and flooded ground against dug-in German defenders, costing American units casualty rates that hollowed out platoons and companies and left survivors running on diminishing reserves of nerve. These men had done their part. They had earned the relative quiet of the Ardennes, and they believed, as their commanders believed, that the forests around them would remain quiet while they refitted, absorbed replacements, and rebuilt the kind of unit cohesion that only time and rest can restore. They were not wrong to believe it. They were simply operating on information that was about to be rendered catastrophically obsolete. The divisions newly arriving in the sector faced a different kind of vulnerability. They had trained, they had crossed the Atlantic, they had moved through the replacement system, but they had not yet stood in a German barrage or held a line under armored assault. Combat experience is not transferable by instruction or by observation. It accumulates through exposure, through fear mastered, and decisions made under fire, through the specific and irreplaceable education of surviving contact with an enemy who is trying to kill you. Green divisions in the Ardennes in the early weeks of December 1944 had none of that, and their officers knew it, and accepted the Ardennes posting as an opportunity to build it gradually, without the catastrophic introduction of a major offensive. What awaited them instead would be as abrupt and violent an education as any American unit received during the entire European war. American intelligence had not been entirely blind. There were signals, fragments of information, suggesting unusual activity east of the Aar River and in the Eifel region, German forces moving at night, radio traffic shifting in patterns that deserved closer examination. Some frontline officers reported hearing engine sounds in the darkness beyond their positions, the unmistakable rumble of armor that could not be entirely explained by routine German movement. These reports moved up through channels, were assessed, were weighed against the prevailing interpretation that Germany was exhausted, that the Wehrmacht was reeling, that any German build-up was likely defensive in nature, drawing forces forward to reinforce the Siegfried Line against the expected Allied push. The information existed. The willingness to interpret it correctly did not. Confirmation bias is not unique to any one army or any one era, but its cost in the Ardennes would prove extraordinary. There was also the matter of Allied air reconnaissance, which had been the eyes of the campaign since the landings in Normandy. But the same weather that Hitler had waited for, demanded for, built his entire operational timeline around. The low cloud, the fog, the freezing mist that settled over the Eifel and the Ardennes throughout late November and December had grounded Allied aircraft at the precise moment when aerial observation might have provided the confirmation that ground intelligence alone could not. The German operational security effort was meticulous. Columns moved only at night. Radio traffic was kept to an absolute minimum. Rail movements were disguised and timed to avoid pattern recognition. Against a blinded Allied air arm and an intelligence community committed to a particular strategic narrative, that operational discipline held. The build-up remained invisible until it was too late for the men on the front line to do anything but absorb the blow. The physical disposition of American forces made a swift, coherent response nearly impossible. Frontline positions were often separated by kilometers of undefended forest, with observation posts and outposts rather than continuous trenches constituting the actual forward line. Artillery units, headquarters detachments, supply columns, and engineering teams occupied rear areas that had been organized for administration and rest rather than defense. Roads through the Ardennes connected villages that were now suddenly, urgently important as defensive positions, but that importance would not become apparent until German armored columns were already moving toward them. The American soldiers standing watch in the pre-dawn hours of the 16th of December were at their posts, doing precisely what had been asked of them, in positions that had been considered adequate for the front they were manning. The front, however, was about to change. The thinness of the American line was not solely a product of complacency. It reflected genuine strategic constraints. American divisions in Europe, by late 1944, were fighting against the limits of the replacement system, which could not keep pace with casualties across multiple active fronts. Eisenhower was simultaneously supporting British operations in the north, maintaining pressure along the German frontier, preparing for the eventual push across the Rhine, and trying to do all of this while Allied logistics, still functioning partially through improvised port facilities and the famous Red Ball Express trucking network, struggled with the distances involved. Every decision about where to concentrate strength was a decision about where to accept weakness, and the Ardennes, quiet for weeks, had absorbed more of that weakness than any other sector of the front. By mid-December, it was arguably the most exposed position in the entire Allied line. The American soldiers who would bear the first impact of the German offensive did not know they were standing at the point of maximum vulnerability. They knew the cold, they knew the trees pressing close along the forest roads. They knew the routine of watch rotations and morning stand-to, the specific silence of a winter front that has been calm long enough to feel permanent. Some had dug proper positions, others had settled into farmhouses and village buildings that offered warmth against the dropping temperatures. They had small unit radios, field telephones strung between positions, the ordinary infrastructure of a defensive line that expected to be tested slowly, incrementally, in the way a quiet front tests you, with patrols, with occasional shelling, with the grinding routine of a war expected to resolve itself through pressure applied elsewhere. Not one of them expected what was about to be applied directly to them. What made the American position in the Ardennes genuinely fragile was not any single failure of command or intelligence, but the cumulative weight of reasonable assumptions that turned out to be wrong simultaneously. The assumption that Germany could not mount an offensive of this scale. The assumption that the Ardennes terrain precluded a major armored thrust. The assumption that the quiet weeks of November were the weather of things to come, rather than the eye of a gathering storm. Each individual assumption had something to recommend it. Together, they constructed a picture of the front that had almost no relationship to the reality, assembling itself in darkness on the other side of the Our River. And in the pre-dawn hours of a cold December morning, that reality would announce itself with a sound that every soldier on the front line would carry with them for the rest of their lives, the sound of the entire horizon erupting in fire. The 16th of December, 1944. Across the length of the Ardennes front, a stillness had settled over the frozen forest in the final hours before dawn. American sentries stamped their feet against the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds above foxholes scraped from the iron-hard ground. The fog had rolled in thick from the east, pressing down between the pine trees and swallowing the roads whole. In the farmhouses and villages behind the front, soldiers slept in their clothes, too exhausted from weeks of autumn fighting to think much about the silence. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, the quiet of a sector the High Command had judged too rugged and too remote to warrant serious concern. None of them could have known that roughly 200,000 German soldiers were waiting in the tree line, less than a kilometer away. The deception had been months in the making, and it had worked with an almost cruel completeness. German engineers had moved at night, laying roads through the forest floor under strict radio silence. Supply convoys drove without headlights, guided only by white strips of tape laid along the verges. Horses, not engines, drew much of the artillery into position so that no mechanical noise could carry across the frost-stiffened air to American listening posts. The German High Command had forbidden all radio transmissions that could be intercepted and analyzed by Allied signals intelligence, and the communications blackout had held with remarkable discipline for a force of that size. Ultra-intercepts, the great Allied advantage that had so often illuminated German intentions, returned almost nothing. American intelligence had seen signs. The movement of trains, the reorganization of panzer formations, but the conclusions drawn had been the wrong ones. The Ardennes was quiet. It would stay quiet. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, that silence ended forever. German artillery opened along a front stretching roughly 130 kilometers, from Monschau in the north to Echternach, near the Luxembourg border in the south. The barrage was not the sustained, methodical bombardment of earlier years, when German guns had shells to spare. It was concentrated, targeted, and ferocious. Searchlights behind the German lines were directed upward at the cloud base, bouncing reflected light forward across the snow to illuminate American positions without exposing the attackers. The Americans called it artificial moonlight. The effect was disorienting and immediate. Men woke to the sound of incoming shells and emerged from dugouts into a world transformed, a world of orange flashes and falling trees, and the rolling concussion of rounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Telephone wires, strung along roads and between command posts, were cut within the first minutes. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Headquarters lost contact with the front. The German plan was built on 3 thrusts, operating simultaneously across the Ardennes. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, built around Sepp Dietrich's 1st SS Panzer Corps, was assigned the most ambitious objective of all: a rapid advance northwest through the Losheim Gap, crossing the Meuse River and pushing hard toward Antwerp. It was the northern route that Hitler himself had insisted upon, the route that the original planners had considered the most direct path to splitting the Allied coalition. Dietrich's SS Panzer divisions, the Leibstandarte and the Hitlerjugend, were intended to be the iron fist of the operation, the armored mass that would punch through American defenses fast enough to deny the Allies any time to respond. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, drove toward Bastogne, and the wide open ground to the west, with objectives that included seizing critical road junctions before American reserves could fill the breach. In the south, the 7th Army provided a flank guard, advancing more slowly to protect the main assault from counterattack. The entire design assumed speed above all else. The men who moved forward in those first hours advanced into a world shaped entirely by the weather. The fog that had descended on the Ardennes in the days before the offensive was not a coincidence of season. Hitler had held the launch date through 2 postponements, waiting for forecasts that promised low cloud and poor visibility, because without fog, the Allied air forces would be over German columns within hours of any significant movement. The Luftwaffe, bled to a shroud of its former strength after years of attrition, could not provide meaningful air cover. Allied tactical air power, the fighter bombers and medium bombers that had made German daylight movement nearly suicidal throughout the autumn, was the single factor that German planners feared above all tactical considerations. With the clouds down and the ceiling low, those aircraft would be blind. The Wehrmacht would have a window, perhaps 3 or 4 days of weather protection, in which to advance far enough and fast enough that no air response could undo the gains. Everything depended on using that window completely. For the American units along the front, the first hours were a chaos of fragmentary information and broken communications. In some sectors, the initial barrage was followed almost immediately by German infantry appearing out of the fog, advancing so close behind the shell bursts that defenders had almost no time to find their weapons. Support units, engineers, artillery observers, signals detachments, service troops moving along rear area roads suddenly found themselves in direct contact with advancing German formations that had no business being anywhere near them. The psychological shock of discovering that an enemy you had been told was exhausted and retreating was in fact attacking with coordinated force across an enormous front was, for many soldiers in those early hours, almost physically paralyzing. Units broke, others held, fighting back with whatever was at hand. The front did not collapse uniformly. It fractured in places and held in others, creating a confusion that was itself a kind of weapon. In the north, the 1st SS Panzer Corps encountered a problem that had not been adequately anticipated. The narrow roads of the Ardennes could not carry the weight of an armored column at the speed the plan required. Bridges that had been identified for crossing were found to be too weak for the heaviest tanks. Villages whose roads bent at angles designed for farm carts, not panzer columns, created bottlenecks that stretched for kilometers. The Leibstandarte's spearhead, the armored battle group that would later become known by its commander's name, found itself pushing hard against terrain that swallowed momentum as efficiently as it swallowed sound. Progress was made, but it was measured in hours against a timetable drawn in minutes. The elegant arrow on the planning map that pointed northwest toward the Meuse was, on the ground, a grinding, fog-shrouded, tree-lined nightmare of halts and diversions, and routes that refused to cooperate with ambition. The 5th Panzer Army, in the center, made faster early progress. Manteuffel's forces found seams in the American line, places where the front had been held lightly by divisions still recovering from the autumn fighting around the Hürtgen forest, and drove through them with speed that the northern SS formations could not match on their more difficult routes. American units in the center found themselves being outflanked, their positions rendered untenable, not by direct assault, but by the appearance of German armor on roads they had believed to be behind friendly lines. The collapse in certain sections of the center sector was rapid and genuine, producing exactly the confusion of rear areas and command structures that the German plan depended upon. Word of the offensive traveled up the American chain of command through the morning of the 16th, each report more serious and more alarming than the last. Initial assessments had interpreted the German attack as a local counterattack, a spoiling operation designed to disrupt American planning rather than a genuine strategic offensive. By midday, that interpretation was no longer defensible. The reports coming back from frontline units described something categorically different: organized armored columns, coordinated infantry assaults, artillery fire across the full breadth of the sector, command posts overrun, communications severed. Omar Bradley, at his headquarters far from the front, was slow to grasp the scale of what was happening. The intelligence had been so confident, the Ardennes so consistently quiet, that the machinery of American command required hours to shift from complacency to crisis. As darkness fell on that first day, the German columns pressed forward through roads lit only by burning American vehicles and the occasional flash of artillery. German commanders understood with clarity what the darkness and fog protected them from, and drove their men accordingly. Resting was not the priority. Momentum was. For every kilometer covered before Allied air could intervene, the plan gained another degree of possibility. For every American unit bypassed rather than engaged, the advance bought more time against the inevitable response. The soldiers moving through the forest that night, cold, exhausted, running on fuel rations that were already tighter than the plan had assumed, believed they were advancing toward a final, war-ending blow. They could not know how short the weather window actually was, or how quickly the Americans would find the edges of their shock and begin to push back. The opening of the Ardennes Offensive was, in the narrow military sense, a success. Tactical surprise had been achieved against a force that should have been better positioned to detect and resist it. The fog and darkness had performed exactly the function Hitler had demanded of them, grounding Allied air power at the moment it was most needed. German columns had advanced through gaps in the American line and created the conditions for a deeper penetration that might, under different circumstances, have been exploited to devastating effect. But even in those first hours, the shape of what was coming began to form in the responses of the defenders. The units that did not break, the positions that held, the officers who refused to accept that the situation was as catastrophic as it appeared. The front had been cracked open, but it had not been broken, and that difference, invisible in the fog and darkness of the 16th of December, would come to define everything that followed. The morning of the 16th of December, 1944, broke grey and cold across the Ardennes. German artillery had been thundering for hours, thousands of guns positioned along the entire front, launching a coordinated barrage that shattered the pre-dawn silence and jolted American soldiers awake in their foxholes, and billets scattered across the forest. But the noise and chaos were only the opening act of a much larger catastrophe taking shape in the fog and darkness. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, positioned north of the breakthrough sector, was about to launch its full weight against the American positions around Malmedy and Stavelot, a mechanized avalanche that would shatter the American defenses and send shockwaves through the entire command structure of the First Army. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division rolled forward in the pre-dawn gloom, with approximately 200 tanks and assault guns, accompanied by motorized grenadier companies riding in armored personnel carriers and truck-mounted infantry formations. The division's commander, Sepp Dietrich, had ordered his subordinate formations to move aggressively, to bypass points of resistance rather than become bogged down in sustained firefights, and to drive eastward as rapidly as fuel and mechanical breakdown would permit. The SS Panzer crews were among the most experienced German soldiers remaining on the Western Front, veterans of campaigns in Russia and France who had been pulled back during November to participate in this final gamble. Morale in the Leibstandarte formations was high, despite the apparent desperation of the strategic situation. Many SS officers believed that one concentrated blow of overwhelming force could crack the American line and achieve the breakthrough that would change everything. What greeted the Leibstandarte as it advanced through the broken terrain and scattered villages of the Ardennes was not the organized, determined defense that German intelligence had feared. Instead, the division encountered American support troops, driver personnel, signal corps soldiers, medics, and administrative personnel who had been positioned in the rear areas based on the assumption that the Ardennes front would remain quiet for weeks or even months. Artillery observers and forward air controllers were scattered across the landscape, reporting back to headquarters that could barely comprehend the magnitude of the German assault underway. Infantry companies that had been rotated into the sector for rest and recuperation found themselves suddenly engaged by armored forces they had no realistic means of defeating, and the confusion, the fog of war, was total and complete. Many American soldiers, encountering German tanks emerging from the mist for the first time, made the rational but catastrophic decision to retreat, to fall back toward the American rear areas where they could link up with organized defensive positions. The German infiltration tactics compounded the chaos and fear spreading through the American rear. SS commanders had prepared special reconnaissance and sabotage units, composed of men fluent in English, dressed in American uniforms, and equipped with forged American identification documents. These commando teams, numbering roughly 800 men under the command of Otto Skorzeny, were inserted behind American lines with orders to seize bridges, spread confusion about German movements, and disrupt American command and control. Though the commando operation was ultimately less successful than German planners had hoped, many of the infiltrators were captured or killed, and only a handful of objectives were actually seized. The psychological impact was enormous. American soldiers, already confused by the sudden German offensive, began to suspect that German agents were everywhere, that formations appearing in the fog might be German infiltrators rather than friendly troops. Checkpoints became more aggressive, soldiers questioned one another with increasing suspicion, and rumors spread through the American ranks that German agents had infiltrated division headquarters and that enemy paratroops were being dropped behind the lines by aircraft. The speed of the Leibstandarte's advance was extraordinary by the standards of modern warfare. On the first day, the division's spearhead columns drove nearly 30 kilometers eastward, shattering American positions and leaving behind a trail of captured vehicles, destroyed American gun emplacements, and confused American soldiers, either retreating in disorder or surrendering when faced with the overwhelming firepower of the German mechanized assault. The American defenders, many of them anti-aircraft troops and support personnel who had been pressed into combat roles, lacked the training and equipment to effectively resist organized panzer formations. American anti-tank guns were scarce in the sector and often in the wrong locations when the German attack came. Rocket launcher teams, when they were available, suffered from mechanical difficulties and lack of training in engaging moving targets from close range. The Leibstandarte, moving with ruthless determination, simply overwhelmed isolated American positions and continued rolling eastward. By late morning of the 16th of December, American command structures were in a state of near panic. Reports were flooding in from the Ardennes sector of massive German attacks, of American positions being overrun, of mechanized columns appearing in areas that American intelligence had assessed as relatively secure. The First Army commander, Omar Bradley, was initially skeptical of the scope of the German offensive. Reports were fragmentary, confused, and the strategic situation seemed impossible. How could the Germans mount a major offensive when they were retreating across all other sectors of the front? But as the day progressed, and more reports came in from multiple division headquarters and from forward observers, the reality became undeniable. Germany had launched a massive coordinated attack, and the American lines in the Ardennes were being shattered. The Leibstandarte was advancing through the sector like a knife through butter, and nothing American commanders had immediately available appeared capable of stopping it. The German knowledge of American radio frequencies and their ability to monitor American communications in near real time created an additional layer of crisis for American forces. German radio intercept units, positioned throughout the German attack sector, were systematically listening to American divisional, regimental, and company-level radio transmissions. When American units transmitted their positions, German artillery could quickly shift fire to engage them. When American commanders ordered troops to withdraw or reposition, German forces anticipated the movement and were waiting. When American air support was called in, German commanders already knew the locations of the American forward air controllers and could direct anti-aircraft fire to suppress them. This intelligence advantage meant that the Leibstandarte's commanders, despite the fog and confusion of combat, maintained better situational awareness than American commanders, who were frantically trying to assemble a coherent picture of the battlefield from confused radio reports and courier messages. Stavelot, a strategically important town controlling bridges across the Amblève River, fell to German forces on the 16th of December with relatively little organized resistance. American defenders were overwhelmed by the scale and ferocity of the German assault, and the town became one of the first significant German conquests of the offensive. The bridges across the Amblève were not destroyed in time to prevent German passage, a critical mistake that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire Ardennes campaign. From Stavelot, the Leibstandarte's columns continued rolling eastward, driving toward Malmedy and beyond, encountering occasional American resistance, but nothing that could mount any kind of effective counterattack or defensive line. The German advance was creating what military strategists call a rupture, not simply a breakthrough of the front lines, but a complete collapse of American defensive coherence across the entire sector, with American units scattered, disorganized, and falling back in disorder. The psychological impact of encountering German panzer formations after weeks of believing that German military power had been broken was devastating to American morale. Soldiers who had watched German armies being driven backward for months suddenly found themselves facing overwhelming German armored formations, advancing at terrifying speed. Officers at all levels were struggling to comprehend the intelligence picture. Was this a local penetration that could be contained, or was this a major strategic offensive aimed at objectives deep in the American rear? Radio discipline broke down as panicked commanders transmitted urgent requests for support and information up the chain of command. Supply lines began breaking down as American logistical units, fearing being overrun by German armor, began displacing rearward. Ammunition, fuel, and food began becoming scarce, precisely at the moment when American units most needed maximum firepower to resist the German assault. By the evening of the 16th of December, the Leibstandarte had advanced more than 40 kilometers from its starting positions. American formations that had been positioned in the line at dawn were scattered across dozens of kilometers of countryside, either retreating toward the rear areas or surrendering to overwhelming German force. The division had captured vast quantities of American supplies and equipment abandoned by retreating support units, trucks, ammunition, gasoline, and food that German logistical services desperately needed. More importantly for the immediate campaign, The Leibstandarte had achieved what German commanders desired most: tactical surprise, rapid penetration of American defenses, and the psychological collapse of American resistance in the sector. German commanders looked at these early successes and believed that if this momentum could be sustained for just a few more days, if the weather remained poor and German air reconnaissance could not materialize, then perhaps the impossible dream of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Anglo-American alliance could still become reality. The opening phase of the Ardennes Offensive represented the rare instance in modern warfare where deception, surprise, and tactical excellence had combined to achieve a breakthrough of major proportions. American military forces, stretched thin across a broad front, had been caught off guard by the magnitude of German effort and the ruthless determination with which German panzer formations drove eastward. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, for all the ideological corruption of the Nazi regime it served, was a military formation of genuine tactical and operational competence. Its soldiers were well trained, its commanders experienced, and its equipment formidable. In the first days of the campaign, before American reinforcements could arrive, and before American air power could intervene, the Leibstandarte and its sister formations appeared unstoppable. But the appearance of unstoppable momentum would itself prove to be an illusion, a momentary advantage that would evaporate as American forces rallied, as reserves moved into position, and as the weather patterns that had been so carefully planned for began to shift. The Leibstandarte was driving into a void that would eventually close behind it, and the breakthrough that appeared so dramatic on the 16th of December would, within days, transform into a disaster. The advance of the 1st SS Panzer Corps through the Ardennes in those opening hours of mid-December proceeded with a velocity that caught American forces entirely unprepared. The German columns, moving under cover of fog and darkness, pushed through disorganized American positions with a momentum born from surprise and superior coordination. As the mechanized formations swept deeper into Belgian territory, their spearheads encountered not organized infantry positions, but rather the fragmented remnants of support units, ammunition supply dumps, and cluster of American soldiers caught far behind what they believed to be secure lines. These American servicemen, many of them truck drivers, ammunition handlers, mechanics, and supply personnel from rear echelon units, found themselves suddenly engulfed by the tide of German armor and motorized infantry. The confusion was compounded by German infiltration tactics, employing English-speaking commandos who spread conflicting orders and false information, creating panic that rippled backward through American command structures. In this chaos of conflicting reports, panicked withdrawals, and shattered communication networks, small groups of American soldiers were isolated and captured as German mechanized columns swept past positions that had been considered rear areas only hours before. Near the crossroads settlement of Malmedy, roughly 30 kilometers north of the town of Bastogne, a convergence of circumstances created conditions for what would become one of the most significant atrocities of the Western European campaign. An American convoy of over 100 trucks, carrying supplies and personnel, was moving northward along the main road when it encountered advancing German formations. The convoy commander, recognizing the tactical situation had become untenable, ordered his drivers to attempt a breakthrough or disperse into the surrounding forest. Some vehicles accelerated through the German lines and escaped. Others were disabled by German fire or abandoned as American soldiers fled into the nearby woods. A group of approximately 84 American soldiers, most of them supply personnel, but including some infantrymen and artillery observers, surrendered to advancing elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. These men, believing themselves to be prisoners of war, entitled to protection under the Geneva Convention, gathered in an open field adjacent to a crossroads near Malmedy, guarded by German soldiers while their captors prepared to move them to the rear. The events that followed remain among the most documented and investigated moments of the entire Second World War. German soldiers, members of SS Panzer Regiment units, and mechanized grenadier formations, conducted what appeared to be a systematic execution of the American prisoners gathered in that field. American soldiers who survived the shooting reported that SS men positioned themselves at close range and opened fire with automatic weapons and pistols on the captive men, many of whom were unarmed, standing with hands raised, or attempting to flee across the open ground. The executions were neither spontaneous acts of battlefield violence, nor isolated incidents perpetrated by rogues acting outside command authority. Rather, they reflected a pattern of conduct facilitated by the ideological orientation of SS formations and the intensity of combat conditions. Over 80 American soldiers were killed in this massacre, their bodies left where they had fallen, as German columns continued their advance northward. A handful of American soldiers managed to escape by feigning death among the corpses, or by running into the nearby woods and eluding their captors, and their testimonies would become the primary documentation of what had occurred in that field near Malmedy. The news of the massacre spread through American forces with extraordinary speed, traveling backward through command channels and forward to frontline units with a power that transcended its immediate military significance. Officers briefed their men that German soldiers, particularly SS formations, were conducting executions of American prisoners, information that hardened the resolve of American soldiers and altered their behavior in ways both profound and lasting. The massacre became a symbol, whether entirely fair or not, of SS brutality and the fanaticism that separated these elite Nazi formations from conventional Wehrmacht units. American soldiers, who received information about Malmedy, fought with an intensity born partly from recognition that surrender to SS forces might not guarantee the protections supposedly guaranteed by international law. Senior American commanders understood that the massacre would have propaganda value and began documenting evidence almost immediately, recognizing that post-war accountability would require detailed investigation and preservation of witness testimony. The massacre thus became, from its moment of occurrence, both a military fact with immediate tactical consequences and a historical event whose significance extended far beyond the battlefield of the Ardennes. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was among the most ideologically committed formations in the German military, composed of men selected not merely for combat prowess, but for racial criteria and loyalty to Nazi ideology. The division had served throughout the war in Russia and Western Europe, developing a reputation for fanaticism and ruthlessness that preceded it into the Ardennes campaign. Kurt Meyer, the divisional commander, embodied the SS ethos of absolute commitment to victory and racial superiority. A former Hitler Youth leader who had risen through the SS ranks and commanded with conviction that German victory was still possible through overwhelming force and uncompromising determination. The men of the Leibstandarte were younger than average Wehrmacht soldiers, having been drafted or conscripted in waves as the war progressed, but they had received intensive indoctrination in Nazi racial ideology and were bound by oath and training to absolute obedience to their commanders. The culture of the division, established through years of service and reinforced through continuous training and propaganda, created conditions in which violations of international law could occur with less resistance than might have been encountered in conventional Wehrmacht formations. The killing near Malmedy thus represented not merely the actions of individual soldiers, overcome by battle rage, but rather the product of a military culture deliberately constructed to override humanitarian restraint and legal obligation. The circumstances of combat in the Ardennes, with American forces disorganized and retreating, German units advancing rapidly, with a sense of momentum and inevitable victory, and the fog-shrouded conditions that made systematic command and control difficult, created a setting in which atrocities became more likely. American soldiers were being killed in combat. Germans were encountering unexpected resistance. Supply lines were stretched and under attack. Officers were managing formations spread across vast distances. The intensity of mechanized warfare permitted little time for reflection or careful adherence to protocol. Yet none of these factors diminished the fundamental truth that the execution of prisoners constitutes a war crime under international law, a principle established in the Hague Conventions and recognized by military codes of conduct in all participating nations. The men of the Leibstandarte who participated in the massacre were not conscripted civilians forced at gunpoint to participate in atrocities. They were volunteers or soldiers of an elite formation trained to absolute obedience and bound by the ideology of their unit. The question of command responsibility, whether officers ordered the executions or merely permitted them to occur, remains partially obscured by the passage of time and the deaths of primary witnesses. But the systematic nature of the killing suggests at minimum a level of coordination that implies knowledge and tacit approval from officers present. The American response to the Malmedy massacre operated on multiple levels simultaneously, shaping both the immediate military campaign and the post-war pursuit of justice. At the tactical level, frontline American units heard reports of the massacre and adjusted their own conduct in ways that would later become controversial. Some American soldiers and units reduced their willingness to accept German surrenders, particularly from SS formations, creating a cycle of escalating violence. Senior commanders, understanding the military and political implications of what had occurred, authorized rapid investigations and collection of evidence while the campaign was still ongoing, recognizing that post-war prosecutions would depend upon contemporary documentation. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces in the Ardennes, understood that the massacre represented a propaganda opportunity that could solidify American public opinion behind the war effort and demonstrate the necessity of total victory over Nazi Germany. Photographs of the corpses were taken, testimonies from survivors were recorded, and the evidence was preserved with care that reflected the understanding that these materials would be essential for post-war justice. Within days of the incident, American newspapers and military publications were reporting on the massacre, creating public awareness that German forces were committing war crimes and that American soldiers should be prepared to encounter brutal treatment if captured. The Malmedy massacre became inscribed in the collective memory of American forces, with a permanence that shaped behavior and attitudes throughout the remainder of the Ardennes campaign and beyond. Soldiers learned the names and details of the massacre. Officers referenced it in briefings. Supply personnel and support troops understood that the rear areas they occupied were not safe havens, but rather potential battlefields where they might encounter German mechanized formations. The knowledge that German soldiers had executed American prisoners created a psychological barrier that made surrender seem less attractive as an option. Captured men might not be treated according to international law. American soldiers might be better served by attempting escape or continuing to fight rather than risking execution as prisoners. This effect rippled backward through the entire American force structure, affecting morale, determination, and tactical behavior in ways that were difficult to measure but undoubtedly significant. The massacre thus served, unintentionally but unmistakably, as a unifying factor for American forces that had been scattered and disorganized by the German offensive, a common knowledge of atrocity that bound soldiers together in shared outrage and steeled their resolve to defeat the enemy they faced. The physical evidence of the massacre, the bodies of 80 American soldiers left in an open field near Malmedy, remained under German control for several days as the campaign unfolded around it. American forces advancing northward from Bastogne and westward from other sectors eventually liberated the area and recovered the bodies, permitting documentation and identification of the victims. The recovery process itself was conducted with meticulous care, recognizing the historical and legal significance of the evidence. Photographs were taken, corpses were examined by medical personnel, and identifications were made where possible, creating a permanent record that could not be disputed or minimized. The bodies of the American soldiers killed near Malmedy became tangible evidence of SS brutality, and their recovery and dignified treatment stood in stark contrast to the manner in which they had been killed. Families of the victims would later receive remains or confirmation of death, and the massacre would become a central element in the narratives of the Ardennes campaign, a moment of clarity that revealed the nature of the enemy and the stakes of the conflict. Beyond the immediate tactical and psychological consequences, the Malmedy massacre established legal precedent that would shape post-war justice and international law for decades to come. American prosecutors and investigators understood from the moment the massacre was discovered that it represented evidence of war crimes that must be preserved, documented, and prosecuted according to legal principles that were being defined even as the war continued. Officers who survived and were captured faced interrogation about the massacre, and their testimony provided evidence regarding command responsibility and the degree to which the executions represented authorized policy or isolated actions. The investigation and subsequent trial of SS officers and soldiers for the Malmedy massacre became one of the first major prosecution efforts for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials and related proceedings, establishing patterns of investigation and prosecution that would become central to post-war justice. The massacre demonstrated that atrocities were not isolated aberrations, but rather predictable consequences of Nazi ideology and military culture, a conclusion that would inform the broader effort to hold individuals accountable for violations of international law and crimes against humanity. The question of individual responsibility within the SS formations that carried out the massacre reflected a broader tension in post-war justice between holding organizations collectively accountable and prosecuting individual soldiers for specific crimes. Some men who participated in the shooting near Malmedy were never identified or captured. Others died in the final months of the war. Still others survived and faced interrogation, trial, and in some cases, conviction for their participation in the executions. The trials revealed that participation in the massacre was not universal among the SS soldiers present. Some men had refused to participate, suggesting that individual choice remained possible even within the rigid hierarchy of SS formations. Yet the broader culture of the Leibstandarte and 1st SS Panzer Corps had created conditions in which many soldiers did participate, and no systematic effort was made by officers to prevent the executions or to investigate and punish soldiers who committed them. The prosecutions thus focused on establishing that war crimes had occurred, that individuals had perpetrated them, and that command responsibility extended to officers who failed to prevent or investigate violations of international law. The Malmedy trials became precedent-setting efforts in the prosecution of war crimes and established principles that would be applied to similar atrocities discovered throughout the occupied territories and at the end of the war. The massacre near Malmedy also revealed the reality that SS fanaticism and ideological commitment did not guarantee military effectiveness. The American soldiers executed were not captured through superior SS tactics or military genius, but rather through the confusion and chaos of breakthrough operations that caught unprepared American support units in their path. The massacre represented brutality, not military necessity; fanaticism, not strategic brilliance; the exercise of power over helpless prisoners, rather than the triumph of superior force in combat. This contradiction, that the SS formations committing the massacre were simultaneously advancing through American positions with tactical success, created confusion in American perceptions of SS military capability that would persist throughout the remainder of the campaign. The Leibstandarte and other SS panzer divisions were genuinely formidable opponents, equipped with superior tanks and possessing greater tactical coherence than many American units. But their advantage was technology and organization rather than courage or determination born from ideology. The massacre demonstrated that ideological fanaticism could coexist with war crimes, and that atrocities did not enhance military capability, but rather revealed the moral bankruptcy of the regime that inspired them. American soldiers who heard of the massacre understood that they faced enemies motivated by hatred and fanaticism, not by the ideals of military honor or protection of civilians that might have constrained the conduct of their own forces. The legacy of the Malmedy massacre extended far beyond the Ardennes campaign, shaping post-war memory of the SS, the battle itself, and the character of the enemy that American forces had defeated. Historians, investigators, and survivors would return to the massacre repeatedly as they attempted to understand how modern military forces could perpetrate atrocities against helpless prisoners, and what psychological, cultural, and ideological factors made such conduct possible. The massacre became, in many narratives of the Second World War, a defining moment that revealed the depths of Nazi brutality and justified the absolute nature of American commitment to total victory over the Third Reich. Educational programs and historical documentaries would reference Malmedy as evidence of German war crimes and the necessity of rigorous post-war justice. Yet the massacre also raised troubling questions about the conduct of American forces during the campaign, as documented evidence emerged that American soldiers and units had responded to knowledge of Malmedy by reducing their willingness to accept surrenders from German forces, creating instances of American soldiers executing German prisoners in retaliation. The massacre thus became not merely evidence of enemy brutality, but also a moment that revealed how atrocities create cycles of violence in which both sides abandon restraint and begin to treat enemies with the brutality they believe they have received. The immediate military consequence of the Malmedy massacre was minimal. The executions did not alter the course of the battle or provide the 1st SS Panzer Corps with any military advantage whatsoever. The men executed were support personnel, not combat troops. Their loss inflicted no measurable damage on American combat capability. The massacre represented the exercise of power over helpless men, rather than a blow against American military strength. Yet the chaos. The initial hours of the Ardennes Offensive unfolded with a chaos that American commanders had not anticipated. Artillery shells, thousands of them, tore across the landscape in the darkness before dawn on that 16th of December. Radio networks crackled with fragmentary reports of German breakthroughs, panzer columns moving through fog, infiltration teams speaking English, and sowing confusion in rear areas. Senior officers at Army and Corps headquarters struggled to assemble coherent pictures from dispersed reports arriving from overwhelmed frontline units. The weather that had granted Germany tactical surprise now complicated American response, as commanders worked in darkness and fog to understand the scale and intent of the assault. What had seemed a quiet sector of the line mere hours before had transformed into a crisis that threatened the entire strategic position of the Western Allies. The question that gripped every command post that night was not how to advance, but whether a catastrophic breakthrough could be stopped. Dwight Eisenhower received the first reports at his headquarters in Versailles with measured calm that masked the gravity of the moment. By mid-morning on the 16th, enough information had assembled to confirm that this was no localized counterattack, but a major German offensive with multiple breakthrough points across a broad front. The Supreme Allied Commander made decisions with characteristic swiftness. He halted all Allied offensive operations immediately, cancelling the planned attacks toward the Rhine that had occupied American and British forces for the preceding weeks. This decision meant surrendering the initiative after months of relentless forward pressure, but it was the correct choice. Reserves had to be gathered, concentrated, and moved to contain the German breakout before it could exploit the gap in the American line. Eisenhower understood that the immediate priority was not territorial advance, but preventing German spearheads from shattering the cohesion of the Allied armies. He began redirecting divisions from quiet sectors and uncommitted reserves, ordering them to move toward the Ardennes with whatever speed logistics could achieve. Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army that bore the brunt of the German assault, faced a different challenge. His headquarters lay at Verdun, roughly 120 kilometers behind the breakthrough sectors, and initial reports from his subordinate corps commanders were contradictory and often based on incomplete information. Some suggested the breakthrough was localized and could be contained by local reserves. Others indicated something far more serious was developing. Bradley quickly realized that the situation was deteriorating faster than initial assessments had suggested, and he began shifting his mental framework from offense to defense. The broad front strategy that had seemed triumphant weeks earlier now appeared to have created exactly the vulnerability that German planners had identified: a thin American line stretched across hundreds of kilometers with insufficient depth to absorb a powerful concentrated blow. Bradley made the critical decision to commit his reserve divisions to establish new defensive lines, rather than attempting immediate counterattacks that might fail to disrupt German momentum. The German plan had relied on speed, surprise, and American disorganization to achieve a breakthrough before coordinated response could be mounted. For the first 2 days, this strategy appeared to be succeeding beyond even German expectations. Reports of captured American positions, of columns penetrating 20 or 30 kilometers deep into American territory, of supply dumps overrun and support troops scattered, flooded back to German headquarters. Yet even as these successes accumulated, the mechanics of American crisis response were already grinding into motion. Eisenhower's orders to halt offensive operations were relayed through military channels with absolute clarity, and divisions that had been fighting eastward toward the Rhine received new orders to disengage, reposition, and move north or south toward the breakthrough sectors. The American military machine, though surprised and initially disorganized in the breakthrough areas, possessed reserves and logistical capacity that Germany could not match. What Germany had was tactical advantage in the breakthrough sectors. What America had was strategic depth and the capacity to shift enormous forces across its entire front. By the 17th and 18th of December, the first American reserve divisions began arriving in the Ardennes region and establishing defensive positions. These units, drawn from quiet sectors and rear areas, marched or rode in trucks toward the sound of combat. They were fresh, their equipment was serviceable, and they had the enormous advantage of understanding what they faced. German panzer divisions and motorized grenadier regiments that had achieved surprise, but whose momentum depended on continued forward progress. American division and corps commanders recognized this fundamental truth. The German attack could not be allowed to develop freely, and even though the initial line had been shattered in several places, new defensive positions could be established that would slow and eventually halt the offensive. These defensive lines were built on terrain where possible, fortified with field entrenchments, anti-tank guns, and artillery positions that could support one another. American soldiers, shocked by the initial assault but rallied by their officers, dug in with the grim determination of men who understood that this battle would determine the outcome of the entire European campaign. The challenge of coordinating this response across an enormous front was formidable. American corps and army headquarters had to track multiple German breakthrough points, assess the relative danger of each, and allocate reserves accordingly. Decisions made in the first 48 hours of the offensive would shape the entire campaign. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, established his new command post and began orchestrating the defense with methodical precision. He established new defensive lines that, while far to the rear of the original front, were defensible and anchored on terrain that provided advantages to the defenders. His subordinate corps commanders, men like General John Milliken commanding the 3rd Corps and General Troy Middleton commanding the 8th Corps, had been pushed backward by German advances, but were far from defeated. They began consolidating units, establishing positions, and planning for counterattacks that would strike the exposed flanks of the German spearheads. What the German offensive had failed to account for was the psychological resilience of American command structures and soldiers. The initial shock of the assault, while profound, quickly gave way to professional competence and determination. Officers and enlisted men rallied their scattered units, established new positions, and began preparing to strike back. Artillery units, which had been overrun in the initial assault in some sectors, repositioned themselves farther back and resumed supporting operations with devastating effectiveness. American communications, while disrupted, were never completely severed, and the ability to coordinate operations and direct reserves remained intact. German infiltration teams and commandos, sent forward to spread confusion and gather intelligence, were captured or turned back by American soldiers who, once alerted to the tactic, proved more than capable of dealing with them. The network of American supply lines, stretched across entire countries and sustained by tens of thousands of support troops, adapted to the crisis and continued feeding ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to combat units. The role of artillery in the American response cannot be overstated. German forces advancing through the Ardennes encountered American artillery batteries that, unlike rifle companies and support units, could be rapidly repositioned and brought into action against mechanized formations. These batteries, often in retreat ahead of German columns, would establish new positions and launch devastating fire on concentrations of tanks, trucks, and personnel. The German offensive, which had relied on speed to avoid being pinned down and subjected to coordinated firepower, found itself increasingly drawn into battles of attrition where American artillery could be brought to bear. Each delay imposed on the German advance gave American reserves more time to arrive and establish positions. Each German unit that paused to deal with unexpected resistance represented lost momentum that could never be fully recovered. The cumulative effect was to erode the tempo of the offensive and transform what Germany had conceived as a swift breakthrough into a grinding campaign of maneuver where American advantages would steadily accumulate. By the 18th and 19th of December, the full scope of the American response became apparent, even as fighting continued at the breakthrough points. Divisions began arriving from Army Group rear areas, from quiet sectors, where other armies were holding the line, from ports, where they had recently arrived from America. General George Patton's Third Army, which had been operating south of the breakthrough sector, began a remarkable maneuver that would eventually prove decisive. On the 17th, Patton received orders to wheel his army northward and attack the southern flank of the German spearhead. This maneuver required disengaging from current offensive operations, breaking contact with German forces, and reorienting an entire army to move in a new direction while maintaining supply lines and coordination. It was a display of American logistical and operational capacity that few armies in history had demonstrated. Patton drove his subordinates relentlessly, and within hours, divisions were moving north, their supply trucks following established routes, their artillery coordinating fire plans with advancing units, their infantry companies and tank platoons moving with purpose toward the battle. The German High Command, observing this response from their distant headquarters, began to understand that the initial success of the surprise offensive was not producing the strategic breakthrough they had anticipated. American reserves were arriving faster than German planners had believed possible. Defensive lines were being established at multiple points across the Ardennes, rather than dissolving under German pressure. Most critically, the assumption that American forces would be so shocked and disorganized that they would require weeks to mount an organized response proved to be dangerously mistaken. American military professionalism and resilience, combined with vast material advantages and the ability to move forces rapidly, meant that the window of opportunity for German success was closing far more rapidly than expected. The continued good weather that had protected the offensive from air attack on the 17th and 18th raised the specter of what would happen when clouds lifted and Allied aircraft could take to the skies once again. As American units dug in and established new defensive positions, the character of the campaign began to shift. What had opened as a crisis, with the potential to shatter American armies, was being transformed into a crisis of German overextension and vulnerability. German spearheads had achieved considerable penetration into American territory, but they were far from their supply lines, operating on fuel reserves that were being consumed at alarming rates, and now facing not scattered support troops and exhausted forward observers, but organized American divisions establishing defensive positions and preparing to strike back. The soldiers who manned these American defensive lines were veterans of previous campaigns, men who had learned through bitter experience how to deal with German attacks. They were supported by artillery that could bring tremendous firepower to bear on advancing mechanized formations. They had air support waiting on the ground, ready to take to the skies the moment weather permitted. Most critically, they knew that reinforcements were pouring into the sector and that time was working against the German attack. The decision by American commanders to establish new defensive lines rather than attempt hasty counterattacks that might be defeated in detail proved to be strategically sound. These defensive positions would serve as anchors for the subsequent American counteroffensive that would ultimately contain and then defeat the German attack. By consolidating, establishing organized defenses, and allowing German spearheads to extend themselves farther into American territory, where they became increasingly vulnerable to flank attacks, American commanders created the conditions for an effective response. The crisis had not been resolved on the 16th or 17th of December. The German offensive was still advancing, and the outcome of the campaign was far from determined. But the American military response had transformed what appeared to be a catastrophic breakthrough into a military problem that could be solved through the application of superior numbers, firepower, and logistical capacity. The initial shock of surprise had given way to organized response, and from that moment forward, the momentum of the Ardennes Offensive began, slowly but inexorably, to shift. In the first hours of the German offensive, as mechanized columns punched through American defensive positions across the Ardennes, a quiet town in southeastern Belgium took on sudden and immense strategic importance. Bastogne, population roughly 4,000 in peacetime, occupied a position of critical geography. It sat at the intersection of at least 7 major road networks that converged at its center, making it the vital junction through which nearly all vehicular traffic moving northward or southward through the Ardennes forest had to pass. This convergence of roads was not accidental. Military planners on both sides understood that whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of supplies, reinforcements, and mechanized movement throughout the entire operational zone. For the Germans, the town represented an obstacle that had to be overcome or bypassed quickly. For the Americans, it became the key to containing the offensive. The decision to defend Bastogne, rather than withdraw, would reverberate throughout the entire campaign, transforming this small Belgian town into a symbol of American resistance and determination. On the 16th of December, as German artillery fire erupted across the Ardennes and forward American positions began to crumble, the High Command faced a critical choice. Should American forces in the sector conduct a fighting withdrawal or attempt to establish a defensive stronghold? General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, made the decision that would define the campaign. Rather than allowing German mechanized columns an unopposed advance through the road network, the Americans would garrison Bastogne with fresh reserves, turning the town into what military doctrine termed a fortress position, an island of American resistance behind German lines. This decision contradicted the normal logic of warfare when facing a numerically superior and tactically mobile enemy, but it reflected an emerging American strategic insight. If German columns could be forced to stop and fight for key positions, their momentum would be broken, American reserves could be brought to bear, and the carefully coordinated offensive timeline would unravel. The unit chosen to hold Bastogne was the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Maxwell Taylor, one of the most decorated and respected airborne commanders in the American Army. On the 17th of December, as German spearheads advanced toward Bastogne from the south and east, the 101st received emergency orders to abandon its rest area and move northward by truck convoy toward the threatened town. The movement was rushed and chaotic. Trucks rumbled through the darkness without proper reconnaissance of roads ahead. Enlisted men crammed into the backs of vehicles, gripped by uncertainty about what they were being rushed toward. The division had been battered in combat operations since the Normandy landings 6 months earlier and had experienced heavy casualties in earlier autumn campaigns. Many of the soldiers who rode northward toward Bastogne that winter evening were replacements, men who had joined the division only weeks or even days before and had not yet bonded fully with their units. Yet they were airborne, soldiers trained in rapid deployment and combat cohesion, and they moved toward a crisis with the discipline and speed that characterized their branch of service. By the late afternoon of the 18th of December, advance elements of the 101st Airborne Division began arriving in Bastogne, and they faced an astonishing situation. The town was already partially surrounded. German mechanized columns had swept around the town's eastern and southern approaches, and the roads leading out of Bastogne toward the American-held territory to the south and west were rapidly being cut by German patrols and advanced formations. The 101st, arriving in pieces as convoy after convoy pulled into the town, had to organize a defense of the town's perimeter without proper time for reconnaissance or planning. Officers of the division worked through the night, establishing a defensive perimeter, roughly circular in shape, running through farmland and small villages surrounding Bastogne, at a distance of roughly 3 to 4 kilometers from the town center. Machine gun positions were established at critical points. Anti-tank guns and artillery pieces were sited to cover roads leading into the town, and engineering parties began laying anti-tank mines and constructing hasty defensive obstacles. By the morning of the 19th of December, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units were completely surrounded by German forces, estimated at more than 20,000 in strength. The siege of Bastogne then began in earnest, with German mechanized formations attempting to assault the American defensive perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The strategic depth of the terrain surrounding the town worked in the defenders' favor. The Ardennes forest was dense in places, with open fields interspersed with small villages and patches of woodland. This broken terrain made it difficult for German panzer formations to achieve concentrated mass, forced them to dismount infantry from their vehicles, to assault American positions on foot, and prevented the kind of overwhelming mechanized breakthrough that German commanders desperately wanted. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, attacking from the south and southeast, launched repeated assaults against the American positions around Bastogne, sending waves of grenadiers forward to penetrate the defensive perimeter, while panzer and assault gun formations provided supporting fire from roads and open ground. The American defenders, using hasty but effective fortifications, inflicted heavy casualties on each German assault, while directing their own artillery fire against German forming up areas and supply columns moving toward the town. The defensive fighting around Bastogne during the first days of the siege was brutal in its intensity and utterly brutal in its human cost. German mechanized infantry, often teenagers from the Hitlerjugend division, who had been told that German victory depended on breaking through American resistance, charged American positions with grenades and submachine guns, only to be cut down by American machine gun and rifle fire. American defenders, positioned behind hasty entrenchments and fortifications, watched as waves of German assault troops advanced across open fields toward their positions, and they returned fire with disciplined volleys that thinned German ranks with every attack. The winter weather, the same fog and low clouds that had protected German columns at the beginning of the offensive, now became a mixed blessing for the besieged American garrison. Visibility was reduced, making German assaults harder to coordinate, and American defensive fire more difficult to direct with precision. But it also meant that German artillery spotters could not observe targets clearly, and that the weather continued to ground American air support that everyone knew was coming. The men inside the Bastogne perimeter endured constant shell fire, with German artillery units maintaining a sustained bombardment of the town and defensive positions, killing American soldiers and civilians alike. Inside Bastogne itself, conditions deteriorated as the siege continued. The town was rapidly transformed into a forward command post and supply dump for the American garrison, with headquarters elements, field hospitals, and ammunition supply points crowded into cellars and buildings that offered whatever shelter could be found. Casualties from the fighting around the perimeter were brought into field hospitals that were themselves under fire, where medical personnel worked without adequate supplies or facilities to treat the growing stream of wounded men. The American garrison numbered roughly 7,000 combat and support troops, defending a perimeter that was far too large for such a small force to hold with continuous lines. Instead, American commanders established a series of strongpoints and defensive positions that were interconnected by fire, but often separated by stretches of terrain that were not continuously occupied. This defensive scheme, born of necessity and improvisation, rather than careful planning, somehow held together through fierce German assaults and relentless shelling. The American soldiers defending Bastogne received encouragement from radio broadcasts, reporting that relief forces were moving northward and that General George Patton's Third Army was wheeling northward in a dramatic maneuver designed to relieve the siege. The German command structure surrounding Bastogne was itself fractured and uncertain about how to proceed. Different German army groups were fighting in the Ardennes, and they did not coordinate perfectly, particularly as the offensive began to lose momentum. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, driving northward toward its ultimate objectives, viewed Bastogne as an obstacle to be cleared quickly, but not an objective worthy of committing massive resources to capture. German commanders debated whether to assault the town directly, at the cost of halting their northern advance, or whether to bypass the town and continue northward, accepting that American forces inside Bastogne represented a threat to German supply lines running southward. This strategic uncertainty led to a series of half-hearted assaults against American positions rather than a determined, coordinated assault with overwhelming force. Each German attack was repelled by the American defenders, and after each failure, German commanders would regroup and attempt another assault from a different direction. The Americans inside the perimeter suffered casualties with each German attack, but they suffered casualties that were proportionally less severe than those inflicted on German assault troops who had to charge across open ground against prepared defensive positions. By the 20th and 21st of December, as the siege entered its 4th and 5th days, supplies were becoming critical inside Bastogne. Ammunition was being rationed, medical supplies were running dangerously low, and food was strictly limited as the American garrison tried to preserve what supplies it possessed for the expected duration of the siege. Then, unexpectedly but not surprisingly to those monitoring the weather, the fog that had blanketed the Ardennes began to break apart, and visibility improved dramatically. American and British aircraft, grounded by weather for the previous 4 days, prepared to take to the air, and German commanders knew that air power would likely transform the situation around Bastogne in the Germans' favor. On the 19th of December, the weather cleared sufficiently for the first Allied aircraft to operate, and American cargo planes began making supply drops over Bastogne, using parachutes to deliver ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the besieged garrison. These supply drops, though imperfect and sometimes scattering supplies across terrain held by German forces, kept the American garrison supplied for the critical days that followed. The presence of German forces surrounding Bastogne created a unique tactical situation. The American garrison was not merely defending against assault, it was under siege in the traditional sense, surrounded and cut off from resupply and reinforcement by ground movement. Yet this situation also created advantages for the Americans that German commanders had not fully anticipated. The American garrison, though surrounded, could call in artillery fire on German forces approaching or assembling near the town. American artillery observers positioned in high ground around Bastogne could direct supporting fire against German supply columns and forming up areas, inflicting casualties on German formations and disrupting German operations. The German forces surrounding Bastogne, spread around a circular perimeter, could not achieve the kind of concentrated mass necessary for a decisive assault because of the distances involved and the difficulty of coordination. German formations attacking from the south faced American forces positioned to defend. German formations approaching from the east encountered defenders positioned on ridgelines. German formations moving from the north were similarly opposed. The geography that had made Bastogne strategically important, its position at the convergence of multiple road networks through difficult terrain, made it correspondingly difficult to assault effectively. As the siege continued into the 22nd of December and beyond, the strategic situation shifted fundamentally. American forces under General Patton, attacking northward with extraordinary speed and tactical skill, were approaching Bastogne from the south, driving through German-held territory and threatening to link up with the beleaguered garrison. German commanders, realizing that the window of opportunity to capture Bastogne or to prevent American relief was closing, attempted several final coordinated assaults against the American defensive perimeter. These final German attacks, launched with regiments and battalions committed in concentrated assaults, penetrated the American defensive positions in several places, but never achieved the breakthrough that German commanders sought. American defenders, bolstered by knowledge that relief was approaching and that the siege would not continue indefinitely, held firm, despite intense German pressure. The final German assaults on Bastogne, like those that preceded them, ended with German withdrawal and the consolidation of American defensive positions. By the 23rd of December, it was clear that the siege would soon be broken. Advance elements of American formations advancing northward from the Third Army's spearhead began making contact with defensive positions around Bastogne, and the American garrison, which had endured 5 days of encirclement, siege warfare, and relentless German assault, prepared to transform from a besieged garrison into part of a larger American offensive effort designed to destroy the German forces that had attempted to annihilate them. The snow fell thick and heavy on the morning of the 19th of December 1944, transforming the landscape around Bastogne into a frozen, featureless white that seemed to erase the distinction between earth and sky. Inside the town, American soldiers dug deeper into their defensive positions, their hands numbed by cold, their breath visible in the frigid air as they reinforced barricades and prepared for what they understood would be days of relentless assault. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed north from reserves in the chaos of the first German breakthrough, had arrived in Bastogne only hours before the German panzer columns cut off all routes of withdrawal and supply, transforming the town into what military planners called a surrounded garrison, or what the soldiers who held it simply called a trap. Yet despite the terrible isolation, despite the knowledge that they were surrounded by forces estimated at more than 20,000 strong, the American defenders chose to stay, to hold, to make Bastogne a fortress in the snow, rather than abandon it to German seizure. This decision, made under extraordinary pressure and uncertainty, would transform an obscure road junction in the Ardennes into the symbolic center of American resistance and the turning point that broke the momentum of Hitler's final gamble. The German forces that encircled Bastogne were drawn from multiple divisions of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, which had attacked in the center of the Ardennes Offensive, while the 1st SS Panzer Corps drove northward toward Antwerp. Unlike the SS Panzer divisions striking in the north, the 5th Panzer Army units surrounding Bastogne were primarily Wehrmacht formations, though they included mechanized grenadier regiments and mobile forces that were every bit as aggressive and determined as their SS counterparts. The German plan was straightforward and brutal in its logic. Capture Bastogne as a critical road junction, use the town as a supply base for continued westward advances toward the Meuse River and beyond, and prevent American forces from consolidating any organized resistance in the southern sector of the offensive. German commanders believed that shock and speed would break American resolve, that a town held by scattered airborne troops and hastily assembled support units would collapse under concentrated assault, and that a bold strike at the town's core would fracture American morale across the entire front. These assumptions, born from 5 years of German success against scattered and demoralized opponents across Europe, would prove catastrophically wrong against an enemy that had learned to stand firm despite encirclement, bombardment, and mounting casualties. The American garrison, holding Bastogne, numbered approximately 7,000 men when the encirclement was complete, though reinforcements and stragglers continued to arrive in the first few days as American units fought their way through German lines into the town's defensive perimeter. The core of the defense was the 101st Airborne Division, elite light infantry trained for rapid deployment and sustained independent operations, commanded by General Anthony McAuliffe, a tough professional soldier who had seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. Supporting the airborne troops were artillery units, anti-tank companies, engineer platoons, and fragments of mechanized units that had been cut off from their parent formations and drawn into Bastogne's defensive positions by the speed of the German advance. Ammunition was rationed from the first day of encirclement, as the defenders understood that resupply was impossible, and what they carried or could scavenge from destroyed German vehicles would have to sustain them through days of combat. The American soldiers understood that surrender was not an option they would consider. The war had progressed far enough that every man knew the likely fate of American prisoners captured by German forces, particularly by Waffen-SS units, and the Malmedy massacre, news of which had circulated quickly through the American ranks, hardened their resolve to hold or die fighting rather than lay down their arms. The German assault against Bastogne began on the night of the 19th of December, only hours after the first German columns had completed the encirclement and established blocking positions on all routes into the town. Wave after wave of German infantry, supported by assault guns and limited panzer assets, attacked the American defensive perimeter in the darkness, attempting to exploit the poor visibility and surprise to break through the American lines before they could be properly consolidated. The Americans responded with disciplined rifle fire and coordinated artillery support, using the interior of the town as a final defensive line and falling back from forward positions when German pressure became overwhelming, trading space for time and inflicting casualties that German reserves could ill afford to replace. The German attacks had an almost mechanical quality. Waves of men and machines would assault a sector, suffer heavy casualties from coordinated American fire, and then retreat, while German commanders regrouped for the next assault, a pattern that would repeat for days without achieving any breakthrough. The American defenders quickly learned the rhythm of these attacks, posting observers to provide early warning, coordinating fire from multiple positions to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the open ground around Bastogne into a killing ground for any force that attempted to cross it in formation. Throughout the 20th and 21st of December, the intensity of the German assault seemed to vary, as if German commanders were attempting to find a weak point in the American defenses or to wear down American resistance through continuous pressure and harassment rather than all-out assaults. German artillery, positioned in the hills surrounding Bastogne at distances of up to 15 kilometers away, maintained almost constant bombardment of the town, striking buildings, destroying vehicles, killing American soldiers in their defensive positions, and adding a psychological component to the battle that was as significant as the physical damage inflicted. The cold intensified the suffering of both attackers and defenders. German troops, operating at the end of increasingly long and disrupted supply lines, often went without adequate winter equipment and fought in conditions that were nearly as brutal as enemy fire. American defenders, though somewhat better supplied with cold weather gear, suffered from the combination of extreme cold, inadequate shelter, and constant vigilance against German assault, conditions that began to break down even the fitness and morale of elite airborne troops after days without significant rest. The loss of sleep, the constant noise of artillery and small arms fire, the knowledge of encirclement, and the absence of any visible prospect of relief created a psychological strain that mounted with each passing day and each hour of darkness. On the morning of the 22nd of December, German commanders launched what they intended as a final, crushing assault against Bastogne, committing multiple divisions and concentrating overwhelming force against the American perimeter in an attempt to break through and seize the town center before American relief forces could arrive. The assault involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions, utilizing attack aircraft, tanks, mechanized infantry, and concentrated artillery fire in what appeared to be a maximum effort to achieve breakthrough before the weather cleared and Allied aircraft could resume operations. American defenders, aware that this was likely the most dangerous moment of the entire siege, responded by consolidating their forces, committing reserves to critical sectors, and bringing every available weapon to bear against the German assault columns as they attempted to cross the open ground surrounding the town. The battle raged throughout the day and into the night, with casualties mounting on both sides, American ammunition supplies dwindling with each exchange of fire, and German commanders unable to concentrate enough force at any single point to break the American line. By the morning of the 23rd of December, the German assault had clearly failed. The American defensive perimeter remained intact. German forces had suffered severe casualties without achieving penetration, and German commanders began to recognize that their window of opportunity had closed. The arrival of clear weather on the morning of the 19th of December, though it came too late to save the battle's outcome for Germany, accelerated the collapse of German prospects even as the siege continued into its final days. American and British fighter bombers appeared in the clear skies in waves, attacking German supply columns, disrupting German command centers, and providing close air support to American positions around Bastogne in a fashion that German soldiers had come to fear and hate across the previous 4 years of European warfare. Waffen-SS units, trained in fanatical resistance and believed to possess superior fighting spirit compared to Wehrmacht formations, found themselves helpless before the onslaught of fighter bombers, unable to take shelter from the air attacks, unable to retaliate against aircraft operating from a tactical domain that was completely beyond German reach. The arrival of weather clear enough for air operations, which had been Hitler's explicit condition for the offensive's success, had instead become the instrument of the offensive's destruction, as German mechanized columns became vulnerable to air attack, and resupply became impossible for formations operating in contested territory. German commanders grasped the reality of their situation with increasing clarity as the 20th and 21st of December passed. The offensive was failing. American relief forces were approaching from the south, and continued attacks against Bastogne would only drain German reserves without any realistic prospect of success. Yet, even as the military situation deteriorated, German forces around Bastogne continued to attack, and German commanders remained committed to capturing the town as long as supplies and ammunition permitted sustained operations. The Waffen-SS elements operating in the southern sector of the Ardennes, though they had initially fought more vigorously than some Wehrmacht formations, found themselves restricted by the same logistical failures and air superiority that hampered all German operations during the offensive. The ideological fanaticism that had characterized Waffen-SS training and combat performance in earlier campaigns manifested itself in continued assaults against Bastogne, even as the strategic situation made these assaults futile. A commitment to the attack that was admirable from a purely military standpoint, but ultimately served only to waste irreplaceable German lives and resources. American defenders, aware that German attacks were becoming increasingly desperate and less coordinated, maintained their defensive positions with the knowledge that time was working against the German forces and that relief was approaching from multiple directions. The psychological dynamics of the siege shifted subtly, but perceptibly, as it became clear that the Germans would not achieve breakthrough, and American morale, which had been tested severely during the first days of encirclement and assault, began to stabilize and strengthen as the prospect of relief became visible on the horizon. On the morning of the 26th of December, American armored forces under General George Patton, advancing northward after the dramatic wheeling maneuver that had begun 4 days earlier, broke through the German lines to the south of Bastogne and established contact with the garrison holding the town. The relief of Bastogne was accomplished not by a frontal assault against German defenses, but rather by the exploitation of German vulnerabilities to the flanks and rear, as American armor drove past German defensive positions and pushed through to the objective, rather than becoming bogged down in direct assaults against German strongpoints. The sight of American tanks rolling into Bastogne brought an emotional release to the defenders that transformed the town for a moment into a scene of visible joy and relief. Though even as American forces consolidated their presence around the town, the larger struggle was far from finished, and German forces still occupied most of the territory surrounding Bastogne. The relief of Bastogne marked the end of the siege in military terms. The American garrison was no longer isolated, resupply could resume, and casualties could be evacuated to field hospitals, rather than treated in makeshift aid stations, with inadequate supplies and medication. The psychological impact of the relief was equally significant. For American soldiers defending the town, it meant that their sacrifice and suffering had been recognized and honored by the broader American military structure, that they had held the line and proven that encircled and isolated formations could stand firm against overwhelming odds and emerge victorious. The 6 days of the Bastogne siege represented a microcosm of the entire Ardennes campaign in miniature. Initial German success and shock, followed by American adaptation and consolidation, and ultimately American triumph through the combination of superior numbers, air power, logistical capacity, and the willingness of American soldiers to accept casualties and hardship in pursuit of military objectives. The Waffen-SS elements attacking Bastogne, despite their reputation for fanaticism and superior combat capability, proved unable to overcome American defenders who were better positioned, better supported by artillery, and increasingly supplied by aircraft once the weather cleared. The failure to capture Bastogne in the crucial first days of the offensive had strategic consequences that rippled outward across the entire campaign. The town remained in American hands. It continued to serve as a supply base and communication hub for American forces, and the German forces that had committed extensive resources to its capture would never recover those losses or redirect those forces to other objectives. The soldiers who defended Bastogne, numbering in the thousands, would carry the memory of those 6 days forward for the remainder of their lives, and their collective decision to hold the line rather than withdraw would be studied and analyzed by military strategists and historians as an example of how determined defensive action, proper command structure, and willingness to accept casualties could overcome enemy assault and break the momentum of an offensive that had appeared unstoppable only days earlier. The transition from siege to breakthrough marked a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the Ardennes campaign, as American commanders shifted from purely defensive posture to planning the counter-offensive operations that would push German forces backward and trap the most advanced elements of the German assault between American forces, converging from multiple directions. German high command, which had nourished hopes as recently as the 22nd of December that the offensive might achieve sufficient breakthrough to force negotiations, or at least create a stalemate, faced the undeniable reality by the 26th of December that the offensive had failed in every strategic objective and was now in grave danger of complete military catastrophe. The cost of the Bastogne siege to German military strength cannot be precisely calculated, as German forces continued to occupy the surrounding territory and maintain pressure on American positions for weeks after the siege itself had ended. But the irreplaceable investment of German soldiers, tanks, ammunition, and fuel had been squandered without achieving any objective beyond delaying American operations. American casualties during the siege and its relief were severe. Hundreds of soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. But those casualties had been inflicted upon a force that could be immediately replaced by American reserves, evacuated to field hospitals for treatment, and whose sacrifice was understood as contributing directly to the broader American strategic victory. The Bastogne siege, in memory and in historical understanding, would become the symbol of American resistance and German failure, though the larger campaign would require additional weeks of fighting before German forces were fully broken and the Ardennes region secured completely under American control. 4 days into the Ardennes Offensive, the German army had achieved tactical surprise on a scale unmatched since the opening campaigns in France. American positions had crumbled, supply lines lay severed, entire divisions found themselves fighting in isolation, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The fog that draped the Ardennes forest had been Hitler's greatest gift, a meteorological shield that rendered the overwhelming Allied air superiority meaningless. Without the roar of fighter engines overhead, without the shriek of bombs and cannon fire from above, the Wehrmacht could move with a freedom it had not known in months. The 1st SS Panzer Corps had exploited this window ruthlessly, their mechanized columns rolling westward through the darkness and mist, advancing faster than American commanders believed possible. But nature, as it always does, began to shift. High-pressure systems moved across the continent. Wind patterns changed. The thick cloud cover that had hung over the Ardennes for 96 hours began to break apart. On the morning of the 19th of December 1944, German officers, looking skyward, saw something that filled them with dread. Clear sky, breaks in the clouds, visibility extending to the horizon. The Allied air commanders had been waiting. Since the very beginning of the offensive, they had been preparing, assembling squadrons, loading ammunition, plotting targets. Eisenhower's Air Force, the greatest concentration of aviation power ever assembled in the history of warfare, sat on airfields across liberated France and Belgium, ready to strike the moment weather conditions permitted. General Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding the 2nd Tactical Air Force, had positioned his units to maximum effect. Every field from Laon to Brussels held fighter bombers armed and fueled, pilots briefed and waiting. The forecast had been consulted obsessively. Meteorologists studied pressure readings and wind speeds. On the 18th of December, forecasters had indicated that the weather would break on the 19th. The Air Force had believed them. As dawn broke that morning, the order came down through the chain of command. Go. Launch operations. Get every aircraft into the air. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Squadrons of Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Tempests began rolling down runways, their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines thundering to life. American Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings rose into the clearing sky by the hundreds. Transport planes followed, bringing supplies and ammunition to the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The Lancasters and Halifaxes of the Royal Air Force prepared to strike German fuel and ammunition depots far to the rear. Within hours, the sky above the Ardennes was transformed from empty silence into a theatre of ceaseless mechanical violence. The German columns moving through the forest below had no warning. They were strung out along roads and forest tracks, their vehicles moving nose to tail in the standard formation that maximized advance speed but created vulnerability to air attack. The Panther and Tiger tanks that led the spearheads moved at a steady pace. Their commanders focused on the road ahead, on the objective still perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers distant. The infantry and trucks and half-tracks followed behind, exhausted men who had been fighting for 4 days without adequate rest. Supply trucks carrying fuel and ammunition brought up the rear, precious resources that the Wehrmacht could not afford to lose. The first warning came from the roar of aircraft engines. Pilots of fighter bombers flying low over the forest saw exactly what they had hoped to find: a ribbon of German vehicles stretching for kilometers, moving in the open, with no defensive formation, no anti-aircraft protection, insufficient strength to defend the columns. What followed was methodical slaughter. Squadrons of American Thunderbolts carrying rockets and 8.5-inch guns attacked from the north and south, raking German columns with cannon fire that shredded canvas truck covers and penetrated the thinner armor of half-tracks. British Tempests joined the assault, their 4 cannons producing a sound like tearing cloth as they fired into German formations. Pilots made pass after pass, sometimes flying so low that ground personnel could see their faces in the cockpit. Tank crews that tried to fight back found that machine gun fire was useless against aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns occasionally succeeded in hitting low-flying attackers, but the swarms of aircraft overwhelmed German defenses through sheer numbers. The tactical situation shifted in minutes. What had seemed like victory just hours before now appeared as potential catastrophe. German columns that had been advancing freely found themselves under constant attack. Tanks that had been moving forward had to stop, find cover, and establish perimeter defenses. Supply trucks were abandoned or driven into the forest to escape strafing runs. Fuel consumption increased as units moved slowly or remained stationary, defending themselves against air attack. The clear weather that had seemed like a gift from Providence on the morning of the 19th had become a curse. Officers reported conditions upward. We cannot advance. Air attacks prevent movement. The supply situation is becoming critical. Requests for reinforcements and additional anti-aircraft defense came back with the same response. There is nothing more we can send. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Allied armies, was nowhere to be found. German fighter strength had been depleted so severely by months of air combat and attrition that there were simply not enough aircraft available to contest Allied air superiority over the Ardennes. What few Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters the Germans could put into the air were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers facing them. American and British air forces flew over 3,000 sorties on the 19th of December alone. Pilots reported German aircraft encountered only in small numbers, and many of those were destroyed. The once feared Luftwaffe had become impotent, unable to protect German ground forces from the aerial assault. The impact on American morale was transformative. For 4 days, soldiers in the Ardennes had fought under the assumption that they were alone, that air support would not come, that they faced the entire weight of German military power without relief. Now, suddenly, the sky above them filled with friendly aircraft. Fighter bombers carrying their national insignia screamed overhead, attacking German positions and German columns. Wounded men lying in field hospitals saw American aircraft providing air cover. Isolated units heard the sound of their own fighters engaging German positions. Supply planes began dropping ammunition and medical supplies to Bastogne, despite German anti-aircraft fire and the dangerous weather conditions. American pilots, many of them flying 5 and 6 sorties per day, in the cold, exhausting conditions of winter warfare, knew exactly what their efforts meant to the soldiers below. There were accounts of pilots flying ground support missions, seeing American troops below waving at them, pointing out German positions that needed attention. The relationship between ground and air forces, sometimes strained during the campaign so far, crystallized into a partnership of extraordinary efficiency. Spotters on the ground radioed coordinates to orbiting aircraft. Pilots attacked specific targets with precision. Ground forces advanced under air cover, pushing German forces backward. The German fuel situation, already precarious, became desperate. Panzer divisions had begun the offensive with insufficient fuel stocks. German planners had calculated that the operation would be completed within a week, at which point supplies captured from American depots would sustain the advance. That assumption had been catastrophically wrong. The offensive was now in its fourth day, and the anticipated rapid breakthrough had not materialized. Every hour that passed meant more fuel consumed, more supplies expended, more irreplaceable resources lost. The air attacks made the situation worse. Fuel trucks moving toward the front were targeted and destroyed. Depots located in the rear areas received repeated attacks from RAF bombers. German vehicles could not move forward due to air attacks, so they burned fuel at rest, running engines to stay warm in the bitter cold, maintaining readiness to move if air attacks diminished. German commanders began to realize that the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. The Malmedy breakthrough, the rapid advance through the first days of the offensive, all of it now seemed like a false dawn. The clear weather on the 19th of December had changed everything. German forces facing American air superiority had no historical precedent for success. No army in this war had ever defeated an opponent that controlled the air so completely. The Wehrmacht in the Ardennes had just become that army. The relief of Bastogne now took on an urgency that transformed military calculations across the entire American command structure. The town had been holding out under siege for 6 days, and the psychological importance of relieving it extended far beyond its tactical significance. American soldiers throughout the Ardennes now knew that relief was coming, that the Germans could not sustain their offensive against air power, that American strength was being brought to bear on an enemy that could not counter it. The sound of aircraft overhead became synonymous with hope. Soldiers who had been exhausted, who had been shocked by the initial German assault, who had questioned whether they could hold their positions, found renewed determination. The clear sky on the 19th of December had cost the Germans any remaining hope of victory. Air power had entered the battle as a force that could not be resisted, could not be negotiated with, could not be overcome through courage or fanaticism or superior tactical skill. Against the overwhelming material advantage of the Allies in the air, the German army had only diminishing resources and fading options. The broader strategic implications became apparent almost instantly to military planners on both sides. German commanders recognized that they had perhaps 48 hours before air attacks, combined with American ground force maneuvers and pressure from relieving formations, would render the entire offensive impossible to sustain. American commanders, for the first time since the German attack began, could see a clear path to containing and then defeating the German spearhead. The weather break had not simply provided tactical advantage, it had changed the entire trajectory of the campaign. German fuel reserves would continue to decline. American reserves would continue to arrive. The window for German success, already narrow on the 16th of December, had closed completely by the 19th. Hitler, in his headquarters, still issuing orders for continued advance, was disconnected from the realities of the Ardennes. The troops in the forest, fighting under constant air attack, understood the truth. The offensive was finished. What remained was only the execution of the withdrawal, the orderly retreat that would attempt to preserve enough German strength to defend the Rhine and delay the inevitable Soviet advance in the east. But first came the attacks, the continued orders to attack, the final squandering of German resources in a campaign that had been lost the moment the fog cleared from the Ardennes sky. The human cost of the air campaign unfolded across a world of destruction and chaos. German soldiers in exposed positions, caught by fighter bombers with no protection and no way to effectively fight back, experienced the terror of mechanized air warfare on a scale that would have been unimaginable to soldiers in previous centuries. Vehicle crews burned in their tanks and trucks. Infantry caught in the open were shredded by machine gun fire and cannon rounds. Supply columns that had taken hours to assemble were destroyed in minutes. American pilots, executing their missions with professional precision, did not see the men they were killing. They saw targets, vehicles on a road, troops in a clearing, supply dumps in the rear. The efficiency of their attacks left no room for sentiment or hesitation. War at altitude, conducted from above the battlefield, carried a certain clinical distance from the human suffering it inflicted. But the result was the same. German soldiers died by the thousands over the next week, most of them killed not by enemy ground fire, but by the relentless assault from the air. By the evening of the 19th of December, German High Command faced a choice that had only theoretical options. They could continue the offensive, hoping against all evidence that somehow the situation would turn in their favor. They could consolidate their gains and prepare defensive positions to hold what they had captured. Or they could admit that the campaign had failed and begin the process of disengagement. Hitler, isolated from battlefield realities, chose to continue ordering attacks. German commanders in the field, understanding the impossibility of their situation, began making decisions that would lead to gradual withdrawal. The air superiority that the Allies had achieved on the 19th of December would not be contested again. Every day that followed would see the same pattern. Clear skies, American aircraft, German forces restricted to nighttime movement, daylight hiding in forests and villages. The Ardennes Offensive had begun as an attempt to resurrect German military power through audacious attack. It would end as a war of attrition that Germany could not win, fought under skies controlled by enemies who could strike at will, and against whom the German army had no effective defense. The weather break on the 19th of December represented far more than a meteorological event. It was the moment when the Ardennes Offensive passed from its phase of German advantage into its phase of American ascendancy. The fog that had protected German advances for 4 days lifted, and in that instant, the technological and numerical superiority of the Allies became overwhelming and insurmountable. The clear skies brought not just aircraft and bombs, but also clarity. The German offensive would not reach Antwerp, would not split the Anglo-American alliance, would not buy time for negotiated peace. Instead, it had consumed German reserves that were needed for the defense of the homeland. Soldiers fighting in the Ardennes on the 19th of December did not know that history would remember this day as the turning point of the campaign. They knew only what they could see and hear: the roar of aircraft engines, the impact of bombs and rockets, the realization that the situation had fundamentally changed. The weather had broken. The air war had arrived, and with it came the beginning of the end for the German offensive in the Ardennes. In the opening hours of the German offensive, while shocked American units retreated in confusion and German panzer columns pushed westward through the Ardennes, a commander in the south recognized opportunity where others saw only crisis. George Patton commanded the American Third Army, operating in Lorraine, below the main line of the German assault, and he possessed both the strategic vision and the tactical audacity to respond in a manner that would fundamentally alter the campaign's trajectory. Unlike other senior commanders who contemplated withdrawal or defensive consolidation, Patton saw the German breakthrough not as a catastrophe, but as a strategic opening, a chance to strike the exposed flank of an enemy committed to a forward assault and unable to defend against a coordinated counterattack. On the 16th of December, when German artillery began its preparatory bombardment in the north, Patton was attending an army commanders' conference at Verdun, where Eisenhower and his staff were grappling with the scale of the crisis unfolding in the Ardennes. When briefed on the German offensive, Patton responded with immediate clarity. The Third Army would pivot northward, abandon its current operations, and strike toward Bastogne to relieve the surrounded American garrison and sever the German spearhead from its rear areas. This response was not born from recklessness or theatrical bravado, though Patton possessed both those qualities in abundance. It derived instead from a soldier's understanding of the fundamental principle that the best defense against an advancing enemy is a rapid, coordinated offensive against the enemy's vulnerable flank. The logistics of executing such a maneuver were staggering in their complexity. The Third Army was spread across multiple corps in a broad array of field positions stretching across Lorraine, with supply lines established for operations directed eastward against German positions along the Moselle River and deeper into Alsace. To wheel the entire army northward required the reorientation of corps-level commands, the redirection of supply convoys from one axis to a completely different geographical direction, and the coordination of multiple divisions to begin disengaging from their current positions and repositioning for a northward advance. All of this had to occur within hours rather than days, a feat that conventional military planning would have deemed impossible under wartime conditions. The 4th Armored Corps, commanded by General Hugh O'Farland, was designated as the spearhead for the northward drive, comprising the 4th Armored Division and supporting infantry formations that would push through difficult terrain and winter conditions toward Bastogne. The 97th Corps, commanded by General Manton Eddy, would advance to the north and northwest of the 4th Armored, establishing a broader front to prevent German forces from shifting their own reserves to contest the advance. The 12th Corps, under General Edmund Musgrave, would maintain pressure from the south to protect the Third Army's flank and prevent German forces from consolidating a new defensive line or counterattacking against the northward moving spearheads. American commanders involved in this redeployment later described it as one of the most demanding logistical operations of the entire European campaign. Units had to break contact with the enemy, disengage from fortified positions, march distances of significant length in winter conditions, and arrive ready to engage fresh enemy forces, all within a time frame that left no margin for error. The weather, which had been the Waffen-SS's greatest ally during the opening days of the offensive, became progressively less favorable as the American redeployment accelerated northward. Dense fog and low cloud cover continued to ground Allied air power, meaning the advancing American columns would receive no support from fighter bombers or transport aircraft during their approach to the Ardennes. Roads in Lorraine and approaching the Ardennes were congested with military traffic, creating bottlenecks that threatened to slow the American advance and potentially allow German forces to establish defensive positions before the Third Army could achieve decisive impact. Supply lines stretched long and thin as the Third Army extended northward, requiring constant attention from logistics officers and transportation units to ensure that advancing divisions maintained adequate stocks of fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies needed for sustained combat operations. The advancing American columns moved at night when possible, and during daylight hours when the tactical situation demanded rapid progress, with officers driving their troops forward despite exhaustion, difficult road conditions, and the ever-present threat of German air attack once the weather cleared. Soldiers of the 4th Armored Division later recalled the intensity of the northward march, the constant movement without adequate rest, the uncertainty of where German forces might be encountered, the knowledge that American soldiers were surrounded at Bastogne, and that time was running against them with each passing hour. The psychological burden of this advance was compounded by the knowledge that the initial German offensive had achieved tactical surprise, and that German forces possessed the advantage in mobility and concentration of force at that precise moment in the campaign. By the 19th of December, the leading elements of the 4th Armored Division were approaching the outer German positions, defending the approaches to Bastogne, and the weather cleared enough for American air power to intervene in the campaign. The clearing skies above the Ardennes transformed the tactical situation in a manner that few commanders, on either side, had anticipated. German panzer and motorized columns that had advanced with near impunity during the first 3 days of the offensive now faced the prospect of continuous air attack from American and British fighters and fighter bombers that could strike ground targets with increasing frequency and precision. The clearance of the weather also meant that American transport aircraft could begin flying supply missions to Bastogne, dropping ammunition and food supplies to the besieged garrison that now faced the prospect of relief rather than capitulation or encirclement. Simultaneously, the clearing skies meant that German commanders could no longer rely on the weather cover that had provided tactical surprise during the opening phases of the offensive, and they could no longer assume that American air power would remain grounded while they pressed forward toward their objectives. The Third Army's advance, combined with the return of air power, forced a fundamental recalculation of German strategic and tactical options. German High Command had to decide whether to accelerate the forward push toward Antwerp while the opportunity remained, or to commit additional reserves to defend against the American threat from the south and east. The German response to the American threat from the south was constrained by the larger reality of the situation. German reserves capable of defending against the Third Army's advance were limited and dispersed, with many formations already committed to the principal assault toward Antwerp, or assigned to defend the rear areas and supply lines of the main German thrust. German commanders had anticipated that American forces would require several days to organize any counteroffensive, providing a window during which the main German assault could be completed or irreversibly committed before American reserves could intervene decisively. The arrival of the Third Army, much more rapidly than German planners had anticipated, meant that German High Command faced a choice between pressing forward with insufficient reserves to secure the objective of reaching Antwerp, or committing additional reserves to defend the southern flank at the cost of slowing the main assault. Hitler, insulated in his headquarters and receiving filtered intelligence reports, continued to demand that the offensive continue toward Antwerp, despite mounting evidence that this objective was no longer achievable. German field commanders, understanding the tactical realities they faced, began to argue for a more limited objective of holding captured territory and establishing defensive positions to block the American advance from the south. The debate between Hitler's strategic vision of victory through the Ardennes Offensive and the operational realities facing German field commanders represented a fundamental disconnect that had become characteristic of German high command decision-making in the final year of the war. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward Bastogne proceeded in the face of determined German resistance, though German units defending the approaches to the besieged town were increasingly distracted and dispersed by the need to defend against the American advance. German panzer and mechanized formations that might have been concentrated for a final assault on Bastogne's defenses were instead forced to spread their resources to defend against threats from multiple directions, fragmenting their combat power and reducing the probability of breaking through American defensive positions through concentrated force. The American 4th Armored Division, commanded by General Creighton Abrams, pushed forward with a combination of armor and motorized infantry that overwhelmed German defenders, unable to concentrate sufficient force to oppose the advance effectively. On the 26th of December, leading elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through German defensive positions and established contact with the 101st Airborne Division defending Bastogne, relieving the siege that had lasted for nearly 6 days and bringing fresh supplies and ammunition to the surrounded garrison. This achievement, while emotionally resonant and tactically significant, was only one element of a much larger strategic development that continued to unfold across the Ardennes and threatened to encircle and destroy German spearhead formations that had advanced deep into the American rear areas. The opening of a corridor to Bastogne marked the point at which the German strategic offensive began its inexorable transition toward collapse. Though German forces continued to fight fiercely, and American commanders still faced difficult tactical decisions about how to exploit the advantage they had gained, the Third Army's northward advance accomplished its fundamental strategic objective. It forced German commanders to commit reserves to defend their southern flank, rather than pressing forward toward Antwerp. It shortened the supply lines for American defenders, and lengthened German supply lines at a time when fuel shortages were already crippling German mobility, and it created the prospect of encirclement for the German spearhead forces that had advanced furthest into the Ardennes. The maneuver also demonstrated to German high command that the achievement of strategic surprise at the offensive's opening, while tactically significant, could not compensate for the fundamental disparity in reserves, logistics capability, and air power that favored the Americans and their British allies. German panzer divisions that had been expected to achieve a rapid breakthrough to Antwerp faced instead the prospect of fighting a two-front engagement, with aggressive American forces pressing from the south and east, while American and British forces consolidated defensive positions in the north and prepared their own counteroffensives once the Bastogne corridor was established. The human cost of the Third Army's northward maneuver, while not as catastrophic as some military operations of the European campaign, was still substantial. American troops advancing northward in winter conditions suffered from exposure, exhaustion, and combat casualties sustained in engagements with German forces, defending their positions and supply lines. The 4th Armored Division lost hundreds of soldiers killed and wounded in the advance toward Bastogne, while supporting infantry divisions suffered additional casualties, establishing the broader front that protected the 4th Armored's advance from German counterattack. Soldiers who participated in the advance later recounted the exhaustion and stress of the operation, the constant movement in winter weather, the uncertainty about the enemy situation ahead, the knowledge that German forces possessed superior numbers and mobility at various points along the American advance, and the relentless pressure to continue forward despite these adverse conditions. American officers coordinating the advance faced the constant challenge of maintaining supply lines stretched across difficult terrain, ensuring that advancing divisions had adequate reserves of fuel and ammunition despite the distances involved and the disruption caused by the withdrawal from previous positions. The logistics officers of the Third Army deserve substantial credit for maintaining the supply lines that made the northward advance possible. Without their meticulous planning and execution, the rapid reorientation of an entire army would have been impossible, and the German offensive might have achieved its objectives before American reserves could intervene decisively. The arrival of the Third Army in the Ardennes also brought with it additional reconnaissance capabilities and intelligence assets that allowed American commanders to develop a more comprehensive picture of German dispositions and intentions. American reconnaissance elements, operating ahead of the advancing Third Army columns, identified German supply routes, ammunition dumps, and forward command posts that became targets for air attack once the weather permitted American air power to operate. Intelligence gathered by American reconnaissance teams and interrogation of German prisoners captured during the advance provided commanders with crucial information about German reserve deployments and the strength of German units defending against the American counteroffensive. This intelligence advantage, when combined with American air superiority and the growing numerical advantage in reserves, as additional American divisions arrived in the Ardennes, created an increasingly unfavorable situation for German commanders attempting to sustain their offensive against mounting pressure from multiple directions. German field commanders like Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army attacking toward Bastogne, began to recognize that the offensive had exhausted its potential and that German forces faced the prospect of being trapped between converging American armies if the retreat was delayed much longer. Hitler's insistence on continued offensive action in the face of these realities meant that German forces continued to suffer heavy casualties, defending positions they could not hold and pursuing objectives they could no longer reach. The Third Army's northward maneuver also demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of American command structures and logistics systems when faced with strategic crisis. Unlike earlier phases of the European campaign, when American commanders had been forced to work within the constraints of rigid operational plans, the response to the German Ardennes offensive required rapid improvisation, bold tactical decisions, and the willingness to accept significant risk in pursuit of strategic objectives. Patton's rapid decision to reorient the entire Third Army northward, Eisenhower's willingness to commit reserves aggressively, despite the initial uncertainty about the scale and intentions of the German offensive, and the efficiency with which American units executed one of the largest maneuvers of the campaign, all contributed to the rapid stabilization of the American position and the transition from crisis to counteroffensive. The contrast between American flexibility and German rigidity represented a larger truth about the respective military systems. The American Army, despite its greater size and resources, derived considerable advantage from decentralized decision-making, flexibility in tactical response, and the willingness of subordinate commanders to exercise initiative in pursuit of strategic objectives. German military planning, by contrast, had become increasingly constrained by Hitler's personal intervention, by the exhaustion of German industrial and manpower resources, and by the rigidity that came with fighting an existential struggle against enemies from multiple directions, with insufficient forces to defend all threatened sectors simultaneously. By the final week of December, the Ardennes campaign had entered a new phase. The German offensive, which had achieved tactical surprise and initial breakthrough success during its opening days, had been contained by American reserves committed to critical defensive positions and slowed by the Third Army's northward advance that threatened the southern flank and rear areas of German spearhead formations. The combination of air power returning to the battlefield, American reserves arriving in the Ardennes, and the growing realization that the German offensive could not achieve its strategic objectives, created conditions for the transition from American crisis response to coordinated American counteroffensive. German forces, facing this converging threat from multiple directions, began to recognize that further offensive action was pointless, and that survival required establishing defensive positions and eventually withdrawal. The Third Army's northward maneuver had transformed the campaign from a crisis threatening to split the American army and achieve German strategic objectives into a containable tactical problem and a growing German catastrophe. The 1st SS Panzer Corps and other German formations attacking toward Antwerp would never reach their objective. Instead, they would face an increasingly desperate struggle to avoid encirclement and destruction as American forces pressed from the south and consolidated their defensive positions in the north. The strategic significance of the Third Army's maneuver extended beyond the immediate Ardennes campaign and into the Rhine. The Germans had wagered everything on speed. Operation Wacht am Rhein was built on a single, unforgiving principle: breakthrough or catastrophe. The offensive required German mechanized columns to punch deep into American territory, seize critical roads and river crossings, and reach the port city of Antwerp before Allied reserves could be committed in sufficient strength to stop them. The entire plan hinged on completing this vast maneuver in days, not weeks. But as December unfolded with grinding, incremental progress, the mathematics of warfare began to work against the attackers in ways that no amount of Nazi ideology could overcome. By the 22nd of December, exactly 1 week after the 1st SS Panzer Corps had rolled forward through the pre-dawn darkness, something fundamental had shifted. The offensive that was meant to restore German military dominance was instead showing signs of fatal exhaustion. On that critical day, German High Command faced an inescapable reality. The breakthrough, which was supposed to have shattered American cohesion and isolated entire armies, had instead encountered increasingly organized resistance. American divisions that had been scattered and panicked during the initial assault had rallied with remarkable speed. Battalion commanders established defensive lines in improvised positions. Rear area support troops, cooks, clerks, and engineers picked up rifles and held ground against advancing SS panzers. The American army had absorbed the shock of the German blow and, rather than collapsing, was hardening around defensive strongpoints like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and a dozen other crossroads towns that became anchors for a stabilizing defense. Each passing day saw American resistance grow more cohesive, more determined, and backed by increasing volumes of artillery fire that German commanders had not anticipated encountering so soon. The weather, which had been Hitler's greatest gift during those first 4 days of the offensive, was now becoming irrelevant. The fog that had grounded Allied air superiority had lifted on the 19th of December, and what followed was a transformation of the battlefield that neither German planners nor German troops on the ground were equipped to endure. American and British fighters swept across the Ardennes in unprecedented numbers, and the mechanized columns that the SS had pushed forward so rapidly became stationary targets for aircraft armed with rockets, high-explosive bombs, and machine gun fire. German motor pools were strafed and destroyed. Supply convoys attempting to move fuel and ammunition forward were broken up by fighter bombers that appeared without warning. The very advantage of mobility that German commanders had exploited during the breakthrough became a liability on roads and through forests, where American aircraft held absolute dominion. German anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Allied sorties. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to contest control of the skies, never materialized in sufficient strength to challenge American air superiority. Fuel was bleeding away at catastrophic rates. German panzer divisions had been allocated fuel supplies calculated on the basis of rapid, continuous forward movement, based on the assumption that they would capture American fuel depots during their breakthrough and use captured supplies to sustain the offensive. But American commanders, guided by hard experience from earlier European campaigns, had ordered fuel dumps relocated away from the front lines before the German assault began. The captured depots that German advance units encountered were either empty or destroyed. German supply lines stretched backward through the Ardennes forest, over roads that were increasingly subject to American air attack and harassment by American forces that were attacking from the flanks. Fuel convoys that had departed from German rear areas were being ambushed, captured, or destroyed. The panzer divisions that were supposed to race toward Antwerp were instead moving at walking pace, their drivers navigating carefully to preserve fuel consumption, their commanders assessing distance to destination with mounting dread. The human cost was accumulating in ways that were no longer sustainable. The SS divisions that had attacked with such ferocity during the initial breakthrough had suffered grievous casualties. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed of German teenagers who had been raised under Nazi indoctrination from childhood, had thrown itself against American defensive positions with the fanaticism that ideology could instill, but fanaticism could not stop high-explosive artillery shells or penetrating anti-tank rounds. Veteran infantrymen of the motorized grenadier regiments had been killed or wounded in numbers that left company-sized units operating at platoon strength. Panzer crews had been lost to American bazooka teams and tank ambushes. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical prowess, was fighting against an enemy with seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower, equipment, and ammunition. Each American casualty could be replaced within days. Each German loss meant one fewer soldier available for the long struggle ahead. The arithmetic of the offensive had shifted decisively. German planners had calculated that they could advance toward Antwerp while simultaneously holding back American counterattacks from the flanks. But this was mathematics built on the assumption of rapid success. Once the breakthrough stalled, the German force became vulnerable from multiple directions. General George Patton's Third Army, which had wheeled northward from the south, represented a growing threat to German flanks and supply lines. American forces that had been pushed back were now holding positions and organizing more powerful defensive stands. The German spearhead, which had seemed so dominant during those first few days, was beginning to resemble a sword stuck into a block of material that was resisting penetration. The further forward German forces advanced, the longer their supply lines became, the more vulnerable they were to flanking attacks, and the greater the threat that they would be cut off entirely from their rear areas and bases of supply. Strategic realities had become impossible to deny. The objective of capturing Antwerp and splitting the Anglo-American alliance was slipping away hour by hour. German commanders understood that without rapid success, the offensive would devolve into a grinding war of attrition that Germany could not possibly win. Germany lacked the reserves of manpower to sustain casualties on the scale that would be required if the Ardennes Offensive became a prolonged battle. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture replacement vehicles and weapons to offset losses. Germany lacked the fuel to sustain extended operations. What Hitler had conceived as a dramatic stroke that would change the entire course of the war was instead becoming a hemorrhage of German military strength. The entire calculation that had animated the planning of Operation Wacht am Rhein was being rendered obsolete by American resilience and the intervention of Allied air power. Yet Hitler himself refused to accept these realities. From his headquarters at Adlerhorst in the mountains of central Germany, the Führer issued orders for the offensive to continue at all costs. Orders came down through the chain of command for new attacks against Bastogne, for renewed assaults toward the west, for drives to capture road junctions and bridges that American forces were now defending with increasing strength. Hitler had invested his remaining political authority and credibility in the success of this offensive. To accept that it had failed would be to admit that his strategic vision was flawed, that his judgment had been wrong, and that Germany was approaching the end of its ability to wage war. He could not accept these truths, and so he refused to order the withdrawal that German field commanders knew was becoming necessary. He demanded renewed offensives, He promised reinforcements that did not exist. He spoke of secret weapons and miracle weapons that were still in development, hoping to restore confidence that somehow victory was still within reach. The gap between Hitler's orders and the reality facing German commanders in the field grew wider with each passing day. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps, found himself in an impossible position. His divisions had suffered devastating casualties. His fuel supplies were critical. His lines of communication were threatened by American air attacks and flanking maneuvers. His troops were exhausted from continuous combat, yet orders from Hitler demanded that he continue attacking, that he find new reserves of energy and aggression, that he press forward toward objectives that were becoming less achievable with every hour of delay. Dietrich was a professional soldier and a committed Nazi. But even his commitment to the ideology could not overcome the physical impossibility of conducting offensive operations with forces that were systematically being destroyed and depleted. The turning point came with the realization that the German offensive had crossed an invisible threshold. In the initial days, German forces could still potentially consolidate their gains and attempt to organize new positions for defense. By the 22nd of December, that possibility was disappearing. American forces were no longer in disorganized retreat. They were establishing coherent defensive lines. American reserves were arriving from other sectors of the front and from rear areas, in numbers that were overwhelming German reserves. American air power was grinding down German mechanized formations with relentless precision. The momentum that had carried German forces forward was no longer sufficient to overcome American resistance. A professional military judgment would have recognized that the moment had arrived to minimize losses by withdrawing, regrouping, and preparing defenses against the inevitable American counteroffensive. But this was Nazi Germany, and professional military judgment had been subordinated to political will and ideological conviction for years. The mechanized columns that were pushing forward in the Ardennes were running out of fuel, not metaphorically, but literally, in the most concrete and undeniable sense. Panzer divisions discovered that they could advance perhaps another 20 or 30 kilometers before fuel consumption would force them to halt. But German High Command was receiving reports that American forces were being maneuvered into positions to attack German spearheads from the sides and rear. The Third Army's thrust from the south was beginning to threaten the left flank of the German penetration. If German forces continued to advance while allowing their flanks to be exposed, they risked being cut off completely, surrounded, and destroyed as a cohesive military force. This was no longer a tactical problem that could be solved by aggressive tactics or ideological commitment. This was a strategic problem that required a fundamental reversal of the entire operational concept. Yet the orders continued to come from Hitler, relayed through the chain of command, demanding continued offensive operations. New attacks were ordered against Bastogne. German commanders were directed to locate fresh reserves and throw them into the assault. The Führer spoke of the necessity of will triumphing over circumstance, of the need to persevere despite temporary setbacks, of the certainty that one final German military triumph would still be achieved. What was being demanded of the Waffen-SS divisions in the Ardennes was nothing less than the impossible. They were being ordered to continue attacking against an enemy that was becoming stronger, using supplies that were becoming scarcer, and relying on reserves that did not exist. By the 22nd of December, it had become apparent to every senior German commander in the Ardennes that the offensive had stalled, that its objectives were no longer achievable, and that continued attacks would only consume German military strength that was irreplaceable. But they were trapped between military reality and the political authority of Hitler, unable to order retreat, unable to consolidate positions, unable to do anything but obey orders that were hastening toward the destruction of the forces under their command. The momentum of Operation Wacht am Rhein had died, even as the machinery of Nazi command continued grinding forward, demanding one more day of struggle, one more wave of attack, one more sacrifice from soldiers who increasingly understood that they were fighting not for victory, but for the stubborn refusal of their leader to acknowledge defeat. In the chaos of December 1944, as German columns raced through the Ardennes, seeking victory that would never come, something darker than military necessity took hold. The ideological foundation upon which the Waffen-SS had been constructed, a doctrine that saw certain human beings as subhuman, as enemies of the race, as obstacles to be removed rather than prisoners to be processed, found expression in acts of calculated violence that would echo through courtrooms and history for decades to come. These were not isolated incidents born from the fog of battle or the heat of combat alone, but rather expressions of a deliberate worldview embedded in the ranks of formations that had been indoctrinated since their youth. The Malmedy massacre, while the most infamous, was merely the most visible manifestation of a broader pattern of brutality that characterized the Ardennes Offensive. Yet understanding these atrocities requires moving beyond simple narratives of evil men committing random acts, and instead examining the machinery of institutional violence, the role of ideology in erasing moral boundaries, and the way in which organizations can systematically transform ordinary soldiers into executioners. The Malmedy killings began in the late morning of the 17th of December 1944, when a convoy of American support troops, drivers, medics, maintenance personnel, and stragglers from disorganized units was intercepted and captured by advancing elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, near the Belgian town of Malmedy. Over 100 American soldiers were rounded up, their weapons taken, and they were ordered to stand in an open field beside the road, while their captors assessed the military situation around them. What occurred over the next minutes would become one of the most carefully documented incidents of the entire campaign, investigated immediately by American officers who discovered the bodies and interviewed survivors, who gathered testimony from fellow prisoners who escaped, and who compiled forensic evidence that withstood